Good morning. I'm about to read the judgment of the tribunal. A few preliminaries. The full judgment, about 300 pages, is not ready today. Of that 300 pages, the essential part, which is only about 60 pages, is something from which I will read, summarizing quite a lot of it, because you can't read 60 pages either. The remainder is appendices of one type or another that need checking for all sorts of details, including security, and in the hope that eventually, looking at the whole document, including the appendices, you'll be able to hyperlink everything and find everything comparatively easily. But it was important to get the judgment dealt with. There's nothing in the appendices that will change the judgment at all. It's just amplification of what's in the judgment itself. And in any event, all evidence that's been relied on is completely available already on the Uyghur Tribunal website. The names of fact witnesses are not being referred to in the judgment that I'm going to read from today, and that will be available online as soon as I've finished reading. They will be dealt with more fully in the full version. But of course, there are security reasons and other reasons why we have to be cautious about the names of witnesses. The tribunal was tasked with considering whether crimes have been committed against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkish Muslim minorities. And it's done that, but you'll hear only, for shorthand, really, reference nearly all the time to Uyghurs. All those who have contributed to the very substantial work of this tribunal will be listed in the full version when it comes out, which we hope will be early next year, but it's going to take a lot of time to get all those details sorted out. Now, you'll see that there's only 7 of us. Well, I suppose it was a bit optimistic to call something for a final decision in December, especially when there's a pandemic going on. And for associated or similar but slightly different reasons, Professor Manji and Professor Lynch can't be with us today. Professor Manji says specifically that she regrets it, she appreciates all those who've given evidence to the tribunal. I think she wishes she was here, as I'm sure does Professor Lynch, and agrees fully with the judgment. Finally, first of all, when you're using these microphones, it always sounds terribly loud. And then sometimes somebody tells you afterwards, I couldn't hear a word you were saying at the back. Well, there's absolutely no point in my speaking if you can't hear. And so if I'm, for some reason, too near or too far, just put your hand up and then I'll try and adjust my position so that you can hear. It would be nice to think I can get through what I've got to get through within about 60 minutes. I think that may be optimistic. And if it turns out to be optimistic, and if it looks as though we all need a bit of a break, I expect Mr. Vetch will tell me, and we'll just take a short break. And I'm not going to gabble. There's absolutely no point in speaking too fast for whatever I say, which will be, in many ways, a summary of what's on the document. No point if you can't understand it. So, this is the judgment of the Uyghur Tribunal, a people's tribunal formed to consider allegations that the People's Republic of China, PRC, has committed genocide against crimes against humanity and torture against Uyghur, Kazakh, and other minority groups of northwest China's Xinjiang. The allegations are of the gravest human rights and violations of international law. The judgment is about state responsibility for certain crimes. The law on state responsibility is separate from the law on individual criminal responsibility, but in fact the law is very closely allied and usually effectively identical. And in looking at the problem facing us, we've been guided by the Genocide Convention, the Convention on Torture, and for crimes against humanity, the statute of the International Criminal Court. It may be said by lawyers that the law in regard to crimes by state and crimes by individuals are significantly different. It may also be said by some people, and we'll hear about this a bit later, that maybe the law should be expanded. Well, it's not for this tribunal to expand the law, and it's not for it to take risks with the law, and it will simply apply, or it has applied, the clearest and most certain law to its work. It's tried to work a bit like a jury. So the advice it's received from its specialist lawyers has been reduced to a series of directions of the kind that a judge would give to the jury in language that anyone can understand in order for a jury to reach its verdict. One feature of the international legal landscape that's relevant whenever genocide is considered is Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. It does need reading. The contracting parties, that's the states concerned, confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law which they undertake to prevent and to punish. And the world's highest court has instructed the 152 countries signed up to this, of which the UK, the USA, and critically the PRC are all members, has instructed that a state's obligation to prevent and the corresponding duty to act under the convention arise at the instant that the state learns of, or should normally have learned of, the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. And so this duty to act as soon as a state learns of genocide has rarely been acted on. Instead, awareness of the duty may have made states disinclined even to acknowledge genocides may be happening, to avoid the duty that would drive them to act. That disinclination to follow the convention, on learning of the allegations against the PRC, may have led to the very many reports and opinions, to some of which I'll refer, that have been made and published in relation to these matters. And indeed, that disinclination to act may even have led to the creation of this tribunal. What the tribunal has done is to assess evidence to decide whether the PRC, a great, powerful, and successful nation, has been and is attacking with intent of destroying a part or parts of its own population. And if so, as the evidence shows, then it has sometimes done so in full view on the streets, sometimes behind closed doors, sometimes in hospitals, sometimes in purpose-built detention centers, and sometimes in people's own homes. Now, these allegations have not been dealt with in a public, evidence-based way, either by the United Nations or by national or international courts or by governments, save to the extent that the United States has made a pronouncement about genocide without providing either the evidence or reasoning for its doing so. And so this People's Tribunal, like others before it, responsive to a request made, was willing to assess the allegations. And it has done so simply because the allegations have been left unresolved, and because these are duties falling on governments and on all of us to know the truth or falsity of allegations about fellow humans suffering from the commission of grave human rights violations and breaches of international law. And had any other official body or court, domestic or international, determined or sought to determine these issues, the tribunal would have been unnecessary, would not have been formed, or would have ceased its work. And that's been made plain from the outset. The tribunal has borne in mind that the allegations made, much of the evidence provided by witnesses, may come from people predisposed against the PRC, against the Communist Party, the CCP of China, or against communism itself. Now, it would be errant to conceive of the tribunal's work as the examination of a presumed bad state to see quite how bad it is, as some might appear to think. That's not at all the case. The PRC and the CCP forms an enormous government machine running a vast country with the needs of the world's largest national population to be met. Its own values may be respected where its values may be respected except where its actions are contrary to international norms or in breach of international law. And avoiding prejudgment or prejudice may be achieved by thinking of the PRC and the CCP as doing good for its people, or their people, save to the extent that they may be shown in part to be doing bad things, and no other starting point for an investigation could possibly be fair. It's recognized that actions seen as wholly wrong and beyond justification by citizens of liberal democracies might, to citizens of China, seem genuinely acceptable and justified for the public good. And so, I repeat, we have to partition out what may be unquestionably beyond justification and in breach of internationally recognized norms as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the laws on genocide, crimes against humanity and torture. We must set aside that which is unquestionably beyond justification from what citizens of Xinjiang might find unobjectionable. And it's also necessary to look at the events of which we've heard through a clear lens. Countries are entitled to maintain their borders, an entitlement that we've seen both in this country involving Northern Ireland, but say, for example, in Spain. It has to be recognized that where separatist movements exist, they often involve or lead to lethal and other violence where blame may be difficult to apportion. The response by states to terrorism or separatism may result in the suspension of previously accepted norms. For example, the British having detention without trial in the Northern Ireland history. Now, some citizens, we also accept, may tolerate or even prefer authoritarian governments and have no particular desire for liberal democracy, and they may tolerate as acceptable the use of physical force and violence in pursuit of state aims that would seem anathema to those in liberal democracies. Notwithstanding these differences, the Tribunal has been determined to apply universal standards, including those of the Declaration and the conventions to which I've referred. With these cautions in mind, and just to start, evidence from witnesses, fact witnesses, heard at the Tribunal's hearings in June and September, which was largely accepted by the Tribunal, show that in Xinjiang, at the hands of some part or parts of the PRC government and the CCP, hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs, with some estimates well in excess of 1 million, have been detained by PRC authorities without any or any remotely sufficient reason, and subjected to acts of unconscionable cruelty, depravity, and inhumanity. Up to 50 people detained in a cell of 22 square meters, not possible to lie down on the concrete, buckets for toilets to be used in full view of all in the cell, observed at every moment by CCTV. Many of those detained tortured for no reason by such methods as pulling off fingernails, being beaten with sticks, being chained in tiger chairs where feet and hands are locked in position for hours or days without break, being confined in containers up to the neck in cold water, being detained in cages so small that standing or lying was simply impossible. Many of those detained have been shackled by heavy metal weights at their feet, sometimes with hands and feet connected and immobilized for months on end. Detained women and men have been raped and subjected to extreme sexual violence. One young woman of 20 or 21 was gang raped by policemen in front of an audience of 100 people, forced to watch in order that they would understand what could happen to them or others. Women detainees have had their vaginas and rectums penetrated by electric shock rods and iron bars. Women were raped by men in detention centers, paying to be allowed in for the purpose. Detainees were fed with food barely sufficient to sustain life and frequently insufficient to sustain health. Food that could, at a whim, be withheld to punish or humiliate. Detainees were subject to solitary confinement, the lights permanently on or the lights permanently off, for days at a time, and ritually humiliated. The evidence before the tribunal in written and oral form is available on the website, and full understanding of the treatment of the Uyghurs is only possible really by reading, viewing, and recalling the evidence as a whole. And any single witness statement would, in nearly all cases, if accepted as true as they have been, contain accounts of mental and physical cruelty and suffering, such as to cause sustained outrage in many nations, and nations that count themselves as free. There's also evidence of people dying as a result of their treatment in detention, and some evidence of detainees, often comparatively young detainees, being removed from cells by force, never to be seen or heard of again. But there is no evidence of mass killings. Indeed, it is clear that detainees are allowed back into society, sometimes after a shorter period of detention as 3 to 6 months, sometimes then to be detained again, sometimes released into society after long periods of detention and often tortured when in detention, but allowed back into society. Marie van der Zyl, president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, wrote to the Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom last year, saying nobody could watch a segment of a BBC program in which he had appeared and fail to notice the similarities between what is alleged to be happening in the PRC and what happened in Nazi Germany 75 years ago, with people being forcibly loaded onto trains, with beards of religious men being trimmed, women being sterilized, and with the overall grim spectre of concentration camps. Now, such images have led others to make comparisons with the Holocaust, and it was, of course, the Holocaust that led to genocide becoming a term of general use and then a defined crime. Such comparisons may be well-intentioned, but are unhelpful. The evidence of what happened to the Uyghurs is not the Holocaust, and not just because of the lack of evidence of mass killings, but also because of the return of those detained to society, something that was never intended for the Jews taken to concentration or death camps. Genocide in law is more broadly defined than the common conception of mass murder of a specific group. Genocide in law can be established by actions that result in the killing of no one, although such a form of the crime has never in over 70 years been dealt with to conclusion on that basis alone by any court. And so these are matters that the tribunal has had in mind, together with the need to respect how the term genocide came into existence because of the suffering of the Jews, in its review of the law and of the facts, and especially in consideration of allegations of genocide. How is it that the tribunal has approached evidence? Well, witness evidence generally was accepted as reliable, although on occasions not every word was considered accurate, as might be expected given failings of memory that can follow trauma. The tribunal recognizes the courage required by many, if not all, witnesses to provide evidence. 2 witnesses were not relied on at all, not because they were disbelieved, but out of an abundance of caution, given that the PRC failed to respond to the many invitations to take part in the tribunal's proceedings, and that there were questions that just might have been asked of those witnesses from PRC's state material that was, of course, not available to the tribunal for the basis of any questions they might ask. This first-hand evidence of witnesses was supplemented by expert evidence covering a wide range of topics. We approached the evidence on the basis that no adverse factual inference of any kind was to be drawn against the PRC or any other body for failure to respond, for example, to requests for evidence or indeed for suggestions that they might participate in these proceedings. Opinions on final issues, that is, whether crimes have been committed, have been read in reports and opinions, and I'll refer to some of them later, and indeed heard in evidence by some of you who will have been at the hearings, but no attention is paid to those opinions by the tribunal. The tribunal did have to consider as a matter of critical importance whether action and behavior evidenced by a limited number of witnesses could be extrapolated as reflective of what was happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang generally. A confluence of consistent evidence from unrelated and unconnected witnesses, together with documentary evidence, academic papers, media reports, public documents from the PRC, often giving a great deal of detail, provided a uniform picture of life in Xinjiang, showing, for example, the scale and speed of construction of the detention centers, the way people were treated in those detention centers, the destruction of mosques, the state surveillance system, which had such an extreme, intrusive capacity. With all that material collectively considered, the tribunal found it possible, cautiously but confidently, to extrapolate from individual accounts to reach much broader conclusions. From evidence given in person to the tribunal, where the core evidence of all but the one fact witness and one expert witness to which I've already referred, here's another list of the factual findings we made. And this is on the basis of the evidence we received here. At classes in detention center, detainees were forced to learn and sing songs in praise of the CCP and the PRC in the presence of guards, at risk of being dragged from class, tortured to the point of screaming within hearing of those still in the class. Detainees were forced to take medicines by mouth or by injection that affected their reproductive functioning, so far as women concerned, possibly men, and that had other mind-affecting effects of an undisclosed or unexplained nature. Detainees were forced to provide blood samples and subjected to other medical testing for no disclosed reason. Pregnant women in detention centers and outside were forced to have abortions, even at the very last stages of pregnancy. In the course of attempted abortions, babies were sometimes born alive, but then killed. By means of intense monitoring, surveillance, facial recognition, advanced technologies of various kinds, all targeted at the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities, parts of Xinjiang, it may be thought, have become a form of open prison. Neighbors, members of family, and other members of the community were incentivized or coerced in various ways to spy on each other. Acts of seeming insignificance may arbitrarily have resulted in detention, leading to the destruction of families, livelihoods, as well as the associated risk of torture and violence. Religious, cultural, political, and business leaders have been imprisoned. They've disappeared, and in some cases are known to have been killed or to have died. Children as young as a few months were separated from their families and placed in orphanages or state-run boarding schools. In some cases, the parents of these children simply didn't know if their children were alive or dead. A systematic program of birth control measures had been established, forcing women to endure removal against their will of their wombs and to undergo effective sterilization by means of intrauterine devices of a nature that could only be removed by surgical means. Uyghur men have been coerced into marrying Han men, with the refusal running the risk that they would be detained or otherwise punished. So-called family friends, mostly Han men, have been imposed on Uyghur households for weeks at a time to monitor and report on the household's thoughts and behavior. Children have been questioned. The Han men sometimes slept in the same bed as the family, in some cases when the Uyghur man was in detention, with the inevitable consequences of sexual harassment, non-consensual sex, and so on. A large-scale enforced transfer of labor program has been implemented both within the region, but also into, if you like, mainland China. Often separated from their families, the transferees were forced to live in segregated dormitories. Many emblems of the Muslim faith were removed from buildings, mosques destroyed completely, desecrated, converted to other uses such as cafes and tourist centers, burial grounds bulldozed and built over. Symbols of religiosity have been suppressed, and when observed or detected, acts of faith have been punished. Veils, beards, praying, studying of religious literature, or any acts of adherence to the Muslim faith have resulted in long prison sentences. The use of the Uyghur language has been punished. Children from an early age have been denied education in their own language and have been punished for the use of it. Land, money, and business assets have been arbitrarily appropriated by the state, and in many cases given or sold to members of the majority Han population. Communities have been subject to the destruction of swathes of houses often centuries old, and then being forced to relocate to places at significant difference from their erstwhile homes. The PRCs also sought control of Uyghurs living outside China by threats direct to them or to their family members in the PRC. Many members of the diaspora have had no information of their families, been unable to obtain it via officialdom of the PRC, and the PRC has imprisoned sometimes to long sentences relatives of those who've spoken out publicly about circumstances of life in Xinjiang. And the PRC has sometimes compelled countries where it can exert economic pressure to return Uyghurs to China to face fates unknown. On the 26th of March this year, the PRC announced that various bodies and individuals, including this tribunal, would be subject to sanctions. Let it be quite clear, these sanctions, which were subsequently justified by a law from China, apparently, have had only a limited effect on the workings of the tribunal, and I'll explain one of them later, and in no way are held against the PRC in reaching the decisions that have been made. I return to the question of reports that have been prepared responsive to what is known to have been or believed to have been happening in the PRC. There are a number of them from reputable organizations or individuals, one from the Bar Human Rights Committee, one from a set of chambers written by somebody called Alison MacDonald, QC, a report by somebody called Yale Grauer for an organization called Intercept, a report from the New Lines Institute, to which I'll refer later, a report by Human Rights Watch, a report by Amnesty International. After the September hearings, two further reports were prepared of considerable interest, one by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and another by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Now, some of these reports are, to an extent, synthesis of other work, but some do contain primary evidence. Most cover the law, not just the law we are concerned with, but whether there are other sorts of remedies that people might take in respect of things said to have been done by the PRC in Xinjiang. The authors of all bar one of these reports, that is the ones prepared before the September hearings, of course, were invited to give evidence to the tribunal, and all except one declined. Professor Packer and Jonah Diamond, principal authors of the New Lines report, came to London to give evidence in person, and the tribunal was and is grateful to them for that. Evidence relied on in the reports included some which overlapped with evidence provided direct to the tribunal, some from other sources, but there were no significant or major contradictions between those reports and the evidence heard by us and some of you here. In particular, the Yale Grauer report, the Human Rights Watch report, the Amnesty report, and the Australian ASPI report added quite a lot of detail, factually, and here are a few examples. One was the use of something called the anti-terrorism sword, which was used at checkpoints, and people simply had to connect their mobile phones to the sword, which would then download everything on the phone of that individual. They explained something about the Me Too Uyghur social media campaign that recorded complaints of disappearances, with over 11,500 such testimonies having been recorded as at December 2020. There was one specific account of use in a detention center of that tiger chair to which I've already referred, where a man was in the chair, cuffed in all possible ways, left in the chair, urinating and defecating for 3 days and nights. Other people in the cell not allowed to help him for fear of enduring the same experience. He died after release. There's evidence of the return to show trials, something previously condemned by the PRC itself. One, for example, in the northern Xinjiang city of Gulya in May 2014 had 7,000, mostly Uyghur alleged separatists and terrorists, tried, or show-tried, in a sports stadium, sentenced before a crowd of 7,000 people. These reports between them explain that there was a significant return to use of what is described as campaign-styled governance, including two particularly important programs, the anti-terrorist and the re-education campaigns. One account in leaked police papers demonstrated how mass incarceration of people included invasion of the family of someone detained, visited daily by the local neighborhood committee to discover what they were reading, what they were doing, what they were thinking, how they were reacting emotionally to the detention of their family member. In addition to that category of evidence coming from reports, there was also expert evidence more generally. A wide range of expert witnesses gave evidence. They covered many topics, including the history of plans for control of Xinjiang, the political structure of Xinjiang, the building and imprisoning of hundreds of thousands of people, we know it may be a million and more, in detention centers, detaining community and religious leaders, the siting of factories within or beside detention centers, the methods of surveillance, the many consequences for Uyghur population of the control measures that were taken. Interestingly, there's detail of the local control by the local community police and by visiting so-called family members, the people of whom I've already referred, and of mass sterilization and of separation of children and families by children being sent to boarding school. And there's also evidence from the experts of the transfer of labor by forceful encouragement and other pressures, and evidence, detailed and extensive evidence of the destruction of mosques and the restrictions on religious practice. Staying with these reports, given that they provide a broad commentary on and often offer opinions on criminality, I'll summarize some of what they've said, remembering that anything adverse to the PRC in the form of any opinion is disregarded completely by the tribunal. The Bar Human Rights Report identified routes to remedy but provided no evidence, and the author of that report was unable to give evidence. The Essex Court opinion, Alison MacDonald, found there to be a credible case amounting to crimes against humanity and genocide. the authors declined to give evidence in support of the opinion even before the imposition of so-called sanctions by the PRC on them, and following the imposition of sanctions, their opinion was removed from public view on their website. In the view of the tribunal, the report failed to deal with several substantive issues of the law on genocide. The Human Rights Watch report concluded that crimes against humanity were proved to have been committed, but said of allegations of genocide that Human Rights Watch had not documented the existence of the necessary genocidal intent at the time, noting that nothing in the report precluded such a finding, and if such evidence were to emerge, the acts committed against Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, a group protected by the 1948 Genocide Convention, could support a finding of genocide. And a Human Rights Watch witness called for another purpose confirmed at the time of giving evidence that that remained the Human Rights Watch view. Amnesty International, like Human Rights Watch, may be cautious in its reaction to allegations of this gravity about the PRC, but like most other reports, it suggested that crimes against humanity may have happened, but expressed no view in its main text about genocide, referring only in a footnote to other reported opinions. And that footnote concluded with an extract from an article in The Economist magazine that said, "Genocide is the wrong word for the horrors in Xinjiang. To confront evil, the first step is to describe it accurately." And it may be reasonable to assume that the Amnesty International report's authors, who felt unable to participate in the tribunal's work directly, were not willing to describe what their report found as genocide. The New Lines report was very clear in its objective, as explained in evidence by Professor Packer and Jonah Diamond. It is to establish that state attribution for genocide may require a lower standard of proof than that required for individuals. They also argued that intent for a state can be proved without making findings about the intention of any particular individual, somebody in the state with power to make decisions. Such intent, it argues, could be established from a collection of objective facts that are attributable to the state, including official statements, a general plan, state policy, a pattern of conduct, and repeated destructive acts, which have a logical sequence and result or may result in the whole or part destruction of the relevant group. And the report found that genocide against the Uyghurs established by each and every of the 5 prohibited acts in Article 2 of the Convention, I'll come to those a little later, explaining that they were all proved, all 5, explaining in the main body of the report that the intent to destroy the Uyghurs as a group is derived from objective proof consisting of comprehensive state policy and practice, which President Xi Jinping, the highest authority in China, set in motion. Explaining accurately that state responsibility for breaches of the Genocide Convention is not a matter of criminal liability and that states may not be prosecuted or found criminally culpable for genocide, the report argues that the heightened criminal standard of proof doesn't apply. Rejecting the need for proof beyond reasonable doubt, it suggests that clear and convincing is all that would be needed to prove genocide by a state. Now, Professor Packer and Mr. Diamond framed several important questions for the tribunal to consider. But the tribunal, as I've already said, is not the appropriate body to attempt to broaden the law on genocide or to run the risk of dealing with genocide other than by the strictest standard of proof, that of beyond reasonable doubt. A people's tribunal that does not apply established and readily understood law to facts proved according to the strictest test may well reduce its public value, which comes from providing unassailable findings of fact and law for others to use. Professor Packer and Mr. Diamond may have given encouragement to those who thought that the tribunal would only succeed if it found genocide proved, which is a wholly inaccurate understanding of the tribunal's function. But they did demonstrate how those who wish to make pronouncements about the criminal culpability of nation-states should have the courage, as they did, to give evidence in public to support their opinions, and the tribunal repeats its gratitude to them, they demonstrating how the freedom of speech citizens of some countries enjoy is a privilege. Thousands of police files, including a database used by the Urumqi City Public Security Bureau and the wider Xinjiang Public Security Bureau, were hacked in 2019 and leaked to the journalist Yael Graer, whose report I've referred to and from whose report some content has been helpful. The same data, shared, I think, by her with the Australian ASPI group, led to the ASPI report, which expresses no opinion at all in regard to criminality, but importantly pointed to the 2014 counterterrorism and 2017 re-education campaigns, and to how the CCP's war against the Uyghurs intensified over that period. The report contained a lot of helpful material, but was published too late for the authors to be asked to give formal evidence or for its content to be discussed with other witnesses. Here are a few of the things, more in the document that you can download fairly soon. First, the 2017 re-education campaign followed on from the counter-terrorism campaign, was expanded to include mass coerced labor assignments, mandatory birth control, more intensive indoctrination. It dealt with something called the Fang Huiyu program, which had had officials visiting people's homes or occupying the homes of Uyghurs and other indigenous families, indoctrinating and surveying those families. It spoke of the Trinity mechanism, which ensured that every neighborhood and village is co-managed by Trinity, three bodies, the neighborhood or village committee officials, police officers, and these external work teams invading people's houses. It explained how the committee's powers had become so enlarged that people really needed pass documents from the committee in order to travel. And it explained how something called the Political and Legal Affairs Commission, PLAC, that oversaw all matters of the police, the procuratorate, the court, the Justice Department, and so on, was answerable to the CCP via, I beg your pardon, I'll start again, all those subordinate bodies that delivered these policies of control of the Uyghurs answered through the PLAC to the Communist Party. Xi Jinping had dubbed the political and legal affairs systems, PLAC, as the party's knife handle, and insisted that the handle be held firmly in the hands of the party and of the masses. The same report suggested or evidenced that during these campaigns in Xinjiang, law enforcement decisions were hasty, harsh, and arbitrary, with senior officials promulgating new laws and regulations in contradiction of existing ones to meet expedient needs of these pressing campaigns. On the ground, it says, local officers openly boasted about acting outside legal process, but they did so with the endorsement of senior leaders and state officials. This report, by the way, is based in part on field work, and that's always something to bear in mind. This is not desk work, this is field work. It explains how in December 2017, the Xinjiang Party Committee launched this Becoming Family program, Invasion of People's Homes, merging it with the previous Fangyu program, and all of it now becoming answerable to the Xinjiang Party Secretary, Chen Huangguo, who will be referred to a little later, sending more than 1.12 million cadres and civilians into indigenous households for a 5-day stay every 2 months. That's the measure that the evidence shows of the invasion of people's privacy in order to control them. Finally, from this report, many senior Chinese officials who experienced personal trauma during the Cultural Revolution, the much earlier Cultural Revolution, had helped orchestrate the Xinjiang crackdown with revolutionary zeal. Two of them were Zhu Hailun and President Xi Jinping. Both men, says the report, were subjected to re-education as teenagers and subsequently claimed their experiences of hard labor were transformative. And so the report comments that after becoming redder than red to survive his family's ordeal during the Cultural Revolution, President Xi turned to Mao's playbook to mobilize the vast resources of the Chinese bureaucratic system to manufacture stability and conformity across the nation. The second report received after the September hearings, the Holocaust Memorial Museum report, was also helpful both in factual material and some opinion, dealing with the much earlier 1980s experience of Uyghurs voicing discontent about the state's preferential treatment of Han Chinese people. And it deals with particular rebellions, one in the town of Baran, with a very large number of Uyghurs, over 1,500, it is said, killed. It deals with an event in 1997 in the Gulya County where protests were met by violent crackdowns. So it sets out the history much more fully, perhaps, than other witnesses had to date. It deals with the fact that there was a history of Uyghurs seeking escape by departing from, seeking escape from oppression by departing from China generally. It covers the history of a small group of Uyghurs coming together in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan and how their presence grew and then diminished and petered out. It deals with violent events in Xinjiang between 1997 and 2008, and it deals with the way that the government profiled Uyghurs as terrorists or potential terrorists in order, perhaps, to marginalize them. I've dealt, I think, with the business of pass books already. It deals further with the invasive system of all the surveillance methods. And in a white paper published in July 2019 by China's State Council Information Policy, is recorded, according to the report, how it was said that the Uyghurs' Turkic ancestry could be denied. It wasn't genuine. It was being argued. Islam is neither an indigenous nor sole belief system of the Uyghurs, but was imposed by expansion of the Arab Empire, and that theocracy and religious supremacism were a betrayal that needed to be opposed. And those familiar with other unhappy experiences in other countries may find some resonance in denying people's own history in the forthright way that was done. The report felt able to build on its own March 2020 announcement, where it had said that there was a reasonable basis to believe that the CCP had committed crimes against humanity of persecution and imprisonment or severe deprivation of physical liberty, and said that in its present report, it was clear that there's now a reasonable basis to believe that crimes against humanity of forced sterilization, sexual violence, enslavement, torture, and forcible transfer are also being committed. It accepted that the limited nature of verifiable information presented challenges to analysis of genocidal intent, and argues that that was by design, the Chinese government continuing to impede the flow of information concerning its crimes, as described against the Uyghurs. The information which has made its way into the public domain, says the report, gives rise to serious concerns that the Chinese government may be committing genocide against the Uyghurs. The fact that it was the Holocaust Memorial Museum report that reached these conclusions, again, we don't rely on the conclusions, but the fact that it was prepared to do so on the basis of the evidence, which does not include evidence of mass killing, relieves the tribunal of some of the concerns that it felt that I've already referred to above about genocide being applied in circumstances so clearly not like the Holocaust. The work of Ethan Gutmann, an investigative journalist, needs particular mention because his evidence will not be relied on, not because the tribunal has no reason not to accept his research. It's more because he himself says what he's doing is work in progress. What that work amounts to is his inviting, as possible, that young detainees in their mid to late 20s were medically examined, found as fit, possibly being marked on their medical cards in some way as fit, and then used for forced organ harvesting. That is, being killed for their organs to be extracted and sold. Evidence supporting this as possible includes not just the pattern of disappearance of young detainees, but evidence of the continuation of the organ transplantation business within China, extremely lucrative as it is. Mr. Gutmann identified at least one site where a hospital detention center and crematorium are co-located. A hospital and a detention center and a crematorium are co-located, a short drive from an airport that has a special express lane in departures for the transportation of organs. Mr. Gutmann does not claim his theoretical possibility is sufficiently confirmed by incontrovertible evidence, and he is no doubt continuing in his work. If such a practice is going on, then killing Uyghurs and others for commercial purposes would have different objectives and intentions from those being considered by this tribunal, and so it must be left to others to prove or disprove his theory. Leaked documents. There have been several leaks, said to be genuine. When accepted by the tribunal, they've always been proved by witnesses who've examined them on the basis of expertise that they have. And so far as the tribunal know, none of the leaked documents has been challenged as to authenticity or reliability in any clear way by the PRC. It's worth observing that leaking of material is evidence that there are those within China who may disagree with the overall policies of government under which they live. There's a full account of all the leaked documents provided by Amnesty, and that's in the judgment that will be on the website quite soon. I must deal with the most recent cache of leaked documents, the Xinjiang papers, which came directly to this tribunal from a source that cannot be identified during the September evidence hearings. Following a preliminary assessment, it was determined that an academic with pre-existing knowledge of the matters to be dealt with should be engaged to analyze the documentation. Various possibilities were considered, but given the need to have an evidence hearing ahead of today's date, Dr. Zenz was approached, and under conditions of strict security, arrangements were made for the material to be passed first to him and thereafter to two peer reviewers, Professor James Millward and Dr. David Tobin. The cache closely resembled documents that were leaked to the New York Times in 2019, but the New York Times have stated that the provider of the documents was not the New York Times itself. Dr. Zenz, Professor Millward, and Dr. Tobin reported on the documents in a live-streamed third hearing of evidence on the 27th of November, and that's dealt with a little later in this judgment. This tribunal has no power to enforce provision of documents or attendance of witnesses, but it has sought material from various sources known to contain material of value. So requests were made to the United States, the United Kingdom, Japanese government and to the PRC itself, none of which has been met by a positive response and provision of material. That's set out in detail in the judgment, and correspondence relating to the seeking of all this material is going to be provided in due course as one of the appendices to the full document. Nothing will be held against the PRC or against anybody else for non-provision of material. However, it's noted that where there are matters of information, there are, of course, matters of information that governments may justifiably keep from their own people, and therefore from a People's Tribunal. However, where there is a real and pressing public interest in the truth of allegations as serious as those being dealt with here, it is unfortunate that the Tribunal has not been assisted in seeking of that truth. Documents available to governments that are not themselves producing them, but that they might have relied on confidentially, for example, the US in making assertions about genocide but producing no supporting material, or could have relied on themselves in respect of concerning other material held by maybe Japan or other countries. It's very unfortunate that's not being disclosed to the public. Finally, on the matters of process, I suppose, it's worth remembering that several parliaments around the world have voted in different terms to assert that genocide has been happening in Xinjiang following debates that demonstrated a high level of public concern for the Uyghurs. The Tribunal has not sought access to the briefing papers in all those different parliaments or been able to hear all the debates, and it hasn't been clear precisely on what legal basis those assertions have been made, and I dare say it's possible in some parliaments that those assertions may have been associated with collateral political objectives. The Tribunal's decision-making has been methodical to consider written and oral witness statements and evidence, reaching factual conclusions based on that evidence when it's considered reliable, and then applying the law to those findings. I've dealt with the fact that the standard of proof required before any finding is made is going to be proof beyond reasonable doubt, because that will eliminate uncertainty for all and avoid the risk of any possible unfairness falling on the PRC. Another general matter, which I'll summarize because of the passage of time, it's important to realize that when evidence is given of detention, of torture, of surveillance, of invasion of people's homes, it's necessary not just to look at it from the point of view of the person suffering what's happening, but to realize that that very evidence is evidence of people doing those things to them and being willing to do those things to them. Just to take an example, for somebody forced to beg at a cell door for food, that's evidence of somebody both making him beg, probably planning for him to have been made to beg, and for watching him on a CCTV when that act is being done. And you can make the same general point for all the evidence of which you hear. And so if overall there is evidence of gross human rights breaches at a minimum, forget about crime, they reveal not just the suffering of the victims, but that there are thousands of individuals who planned the systems in operation, were trained and trained others to do what was necessary to bring the systems into force. There were professionals, architects, medics, engineers, content for their skills to be used for these systems, readied by the PRC to disregard the rights of their fellow citizens. Were these individuals careless of the rights of others from the start? May some of them, not the rapists or the torturers, of course, genuinely believe that what they were doing was for the good of the PRC, did the PRC, by whatever stratagem, create an enormous force of individuals for whom the rights of others meant nothing measured against the demands of the state, or perhaps were not seen as wrong. With all these background facts in mind, the tribunal then moved to some big general fact-finding. Was there a plan? Plan's not essential, but you've got to look and decide what sort of plan there might have been. And so intermittent fluctuating tension between the indigenous groups led to intensification in 2014 of control of the Uyghurs. The war on terror led to some matching of accounts of responsibility for what was going on, allowed the perceived security threat posed by the Muslim majority population, allowed a transformation of the region into a more integrated part of China for economic purposes, said to be security purposes, arguably for other purposes. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2013 and visited in 2014, he demanded an all-out struggle against terrorism, infiltration, and separation, that there should be no showing of mercy. And his responsibility for what followed is covered in part by those Xinjiang papers passed to the tribunal, and you can read about it or hear about it in the evidence recorded on the 27th of November. When Chen Quanguo was appointed party secretary in 2016, coming from Tibet, he came with a record of achieving very considerable control over Tibet by extreme surveillance, detention, and other measures. 2017 saw the de-extremification regulations. Also in 2017, the General Office of the Standing Committee of the Region's People's Congress said it was emphasized that regulations constitutes the implementation of central government policy, decisions and deployments, especially in order to implement the important instructions and requirements of General Secretary Xi Jinping. Other matters of history include a policy intensified in 2018 associated with a speech including or titled, "To break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections." And the manifestation of these policies continued to evolve into multiple, seemingly interlinked plans at every level of regional, local, and community government over successive years. And it covered every facet of Uyghur life. Policies and plans for birth control, sterilization, forcible labor transfer, placement of children into state boarding schools and orphanages, imposition of Han into Uyghur homes, destruction of mosques. Let it be clear, before the receipt of the leaked Xinjiang papers in September of this year, this tribunal concluded that the policies that required construction of hundreds of buildings, deployments of thousands or more likely hundreds of thousands of personnel at very substantial cost. The conclusion had already been reached that this vast apparatus of state repression could not exist if a plan was not authorized at the very highest levels and had been ordered to be implemented by every level of government. And indeed, the tribunal was, before the leak of those papers, and indeed since, satisfied that a comprehensive plan for the enactment of multiple but interlinked policies targeting the Uyghurs had been formulated by the PRC. And then that conclusion was later reinforced by those later leaked papers and Dr. Zenz's opinion. You'll find in the judgment, when it's available, further detail about leadership and central government responsibility, coming from another expert, Dr. David Tobin, who deals with Xi Jinping's rise to power decision-making being increasingly centralized, withdrawal of the presidential term limits, of which probably most will know, of the reference to Xi Jinping thought as now official doctrine. Independently of these witnesses, the tribunal itself had prepared an organogram which set out the hierarchy and interconnectedness of different state and CCP agencies, from which it could be seen that all power flowed from the most senior echelons of government. Professor James Millward drew attention to the specific centralization of ethnic and religious policy. The leaking to the tribunal of these Xinjiang papers and their analysis by Zenz, reinforced by confirmation of the peer reviewers, confirms the understanding by Millward, Tobin, and others that the PRC's policies of such importance to the perceived national security threat was initiated and directed by the party secretary of the CCP, President Xi. And given his control over the apparatus of state power by the most senior officials, including members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. Documents from 2014 show that President Xi authorized the local Xinjiang government to draft what became the de-extremification regulation, which is intimately linked to all the measures of which we have already heard from the other end, from the witnesses. The speeches made in 2014 by President Xi, with other top officials contributing, were mandated to be studied by party and state cadres as they contained the strategic deployment by the party Central Committee for Xinjiang Work, and were aimed to convey and learn the spirit of General Secretary Xi Jinping's series of important speeches. A second series of speeches in 17 and 18 directly implicate Xinjiang's party secretary and Politburo member Chen Guangguo and his deputy Zhu Hailun in an intensification of the 2014 Xi Jinping policies, including the rounding up of all who should be rounded up instructions. These documents are the highest and second highest classification. Some of the documents are absolutely top secret. Directly link President Xi Jinping to the policies and actions that have been implemented in Xinjiang. The tribunal is satisfied that President Xi Jinping, Chen Guangguo, and other very senior officials in the PRC and CCP bear primary responsibility for acts that have occurred in Xinjiang. The tribunal recognizes that the perpetration of individual criminal acts that may have occurred, rape or torture, will not have been carried out with the detailed knowledge of the President and others, but the tribunal is satisfied that they have occurred as a direct result of policies, language, and speeches promoted by the President Xi and others. Furthermore, that these policies could not have happened in a country with such rigid hierarchies as the PRC without the implicit or explicit authority from the very top. I move rapidly through a few other titles, but I'm going to check with Mr. Vetch whether he thinks we should take a break.
I'll carry on, Sir Justice, if you have.
Thank you. Torture. The tribunal is satisfied that within the PRC's penal system, barbaric, cruel, and sadistic torture has been perpetrated. The tribunal is satisfied, so far as rape and sexual violence is concerned, that rape and other sexual violence within the penal system was widespread. So far as regional and cultural destruction is concerned, satellite imagery identified the destruction of or damage to approximately 16,000 mosques, 65% of the previous total in the region. Evidence, by the way, which was matched by evidence fieldwork on the ground from witnesses heard by the tribunal. Cemeteries and other sites of religious significance have been destroyed. Uyghurs are punished by imprisonment and torture for displays of religious adherence, including attending mosques, praying, or wearing headscarves and beards, and surprising when you first hear it, not drinking alcohol and not eating pork. The tribunal is satisfied that the PRC has implemented a comprehensive policy of destruction of physical religious sites, has conducted a systematic attack on Uyghur religiosity for the purposes of eradicating religious so-called extremism. As the people imprisoned and disappeared, most witnesses gave evidence that members, sometimes many of their families, had been imprisoned. Often they had no knowledge of the whereabouts of their relatives. One man told how 14 of his nieces and nephews had disappeared. He didn't know where they were, or even if they were alive. The tribunal was only able to hear direct from a limited number of such witnesses, that they received evidence in other ways from surveys and so on of thousands of people reporting on the incarceration, indeed, of thousands of relatives and friends. And the tribunal is quite satisfied that the PRC has built a very extensive network of detention and penal institutions, that it has imprisoned hundreds of thousands and maybe 1 million or more of Uyghurs without substantive cause and without any recognizable or legitimate legal process. I turn to the issue of birth control, which occupies quite a lot of the judgment, and it is of considerable importance. And it may actually be better first to go to the conclusion and then to explain the component parts of it. The conclusion at paragraph 125 is that the tribunal is satisfied that the PRC has effected a deliberate, systematic, and concerted policy with the object of so-called optimizing the population in Xinjiang by means of a long-term reduction of Uyghur and other ethnic minority populations, to be achieved through limiting and reducing Uyghur births. And the material upon which the tribunal has relied in order to reach those conclusions, which you can read between paragraphs 108 and 123 or 4, first of all, there's the public policies on birth rates. Second, there's the evidence of population growth rates, that is, the ordinary population growth rates of the Uyghur community in the place that for so many centuries has been their home. That is what's material, the natural birth rate. And then you will learn about, from evidence, including from evidence produced by China, by the People's Republic of China, until such time as it stopped providing figures, of the extraordinary decline in birth rates. You'll hear of government broadcasts and other material connecting religious extremism with population growth, of a reference to religious extremism begetting marriages and illegal extra births. The extra births being beyond what was technically allowed, and birth law breaches, if there was a law, being the principal reason for detention, as is revealed in something called the Caracas Papers, one of the other great leaks of material. In 2017, the birth control policy was intensified with a region-wide campaign using these words, to deeper implement the special campaign to control birth violations. That led to, or was associated with, the steep rise in prosecutions and internments to which I've just referred. The authorities deployed an extensive examination program of Uyghur women of birth-bearing age, quotes, testing all who should be tested. And by 2019, it was planned that over 80% in the rural southern four minority prefectures should be subject to birth control measures with long-term effectiveness. The figures for the fitting of these special intrauterine devices that can only be removed surgically are very significant when you compare the figures for Xinjiang with the figures, the percentage of introduction by force or by forceful persuasion of these devices in Xinjiang. You compare the numbers per 100,000 or by population overall with the numbers typically employed elsewhere. A huge majority inserted into women in Xinjiang. In 2019, the authorities formulated a plan to conduct widespread sterilization in 2 counties, Hotan in the south, intended to sterilize, in one case, 14.1, and in another, 34.3% of all women of childbearing age. And of course, the tribunal had heard multiple witnesses who had themselves been forced into abortion. In the case of one witness who was working in a hospital, she witnessed the forced abortion of near-term babies. In a 2021 report to the tribunal from the Uyghur Transitional Justice Data Team was a quoted hospital employee who worked as an obstetrician and witnessed the killing of babies immediately after being born. And so these policies in all led to a reduction in birth rates and a decline in population growth. As to statistics, first of all, there's a graph that you can see which shows things as clear as anything can be, because sometimes pictures are better than words. But between 2015 and 18, the natural population growth of Uyghurs in the southern Xinjiang prefectures declined by 73%. And in 2018 and 19, in several counties, dropped to 0 or became negative. Across 29 counties with indigenous majority populations for which there is data, the birth rate fell by 55% from 2011 to 15. And in those counties, there was over 90% indigenous, which were over 90% indigenous. The birth rate fell at an even greater rate, and so on. And so it is that material overall that led to the conclusion that I've already read to you. There's analysis by Dr. Zenz, but by other people, Leibold and Rusa in particular. I turn to the next topic. Now, one other comment. The overall strategy for so-called optimization of the population has 3 components in the judgment of the tribunal. In-migration of Han, encouraged, pressed to move into Xinjiang to dilute the population. Transfer out by ethnic minorities, including by the forced labor campaigns. But the most effective policy lever was the reduction of Uyghur birth rates. As to transfer of children, between 2017 and 19, the Chinese government figures record a 43% increase to 880,000 primary and middle school Uyghur children being placed in Han-run and Han-staffed boarding schools. A policy, according to Xinjiang Education Department, deliberately designed to isolate Uyghur children from the influence of their families. Parents unable to resist the policy and involuntary separation. And sometimes, of course, the parents being interned themselves. Families completely broken up, and the children being turned towards or into Han culture. The tribunal is quite satisfied that the PRC has embarked on a deliberate policy of separating children from their families into state care for the purpose of eradicating their Uyghur cultural identity and connections. Forced labor touched on already a little. The tribunal received evidence, including by satellite imagery, of the construction and conversion of hundreds of very large factories, in some cases beside internment camps. And according to state media, hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs have been inducted into labor programs, including 611,000 in Hotan alone in 1 year. The tribunal is satisfied on all the evidence that the PRC has constructed a large-scale enforced labor program for more economic development, for security, for profit, for population optimization under the official stated goal of poverty alleviation. Before I turn to the law, I'm going to or the tribunal in its judgment is going to take a slight diversion. In the very recent hearing, the tribunal heard from sociologist and genocide expert Dr. Ton Svan. His evidence came late, but actually came at a very convenient moment for the thinking and development of this judgment. Now, most often, crimes are defined by a country's lawmakers, and such sociological significance as there may be in the setting of the crime, say for rape, or for sexual abuse crimes, or for drug taking, sociological setting comes later. Not always, but usually. For genocide as a crime, the sociological understanding came first. And even though Raphael Lemkin's concept was not adopted in full by the United Nations in 1948, the selection of acts to qualify as crimes of genocide coming later. 4 passages from Dr. Svan's evidence are worth setting out. I'll read from each of them. The first comes from Lemkin himself, talking of what, for the sociologist, Lemkin was both a lawyer, but by the time he was doing this, he was really thinking in sociological terms. He said it's intended as genocide to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups. The objectives of such a plan would be the disintegration of political and social institutions of culture, language, and national feelings. Referring to other previous events categorized as genocides, Dr. Svan explained, in a general sense, genocide can be seen as an organized process of systematic persecution, destruction of a considerable group or category of people by other people under the auspices of a state or political regime. Who belongs to the target group is defined by the persecutors, and the persecutors are not persecuted for who they are individually, or what they think, or what they've done, but exclusively because, in the eyes of the hostile others, they are members of a target group which is to be destroyed. And so genocides follow ideological convictions and the power of ruthless regimes. And he notes that the most well-known of the 20th or latter part of the 20th century are of 3 families: communism, National Socialism and Fascism, and radical ethnic nationalism. He says there are differences between them, but they share genocides viewed from a sociological point of view, a genocidal infrastructure of leading ideas where a cluster of ideas is dominant and determines the outlook and policies of the future of the political elite at the helm of the state. And in those circumstances, says Dr. Svan, mass atrocities and genocidal activities have a high chance of following. For China, he suggests, that the Chinese authorities may refrain from genocidal mass killing, but the regime and its security services dispose of many means of what are called crushing techniques already developed in Mao's time: sharp surveillance, forced re-education in schools, detention camps, forced labor, endless restriction on movements and harassments. And he suggests that the victims stay alive, but, this is the sociologist talking, their freedom of living is nevertheless to a high degree destroyed. For him, genocide may be rooted or take root in many policies with different intentions, and he was disinclined to allow for good motives of a state to be associated with bad, where genocide was happening or is likely to occur. But of course, he accepts, as must be accepted, that protection of a state against terrorists and protection by a state of its borders can always be a legitimate state action. And then finally, and for any who think the present allegations of genocide need not be taken seriously, because mass killing is not alleged. Dr. Svan reminds us intentions are not fixed givens, but they tend to evolve and develop over time. In the case of the murder of the Jews by German National Socialists, it took more than 7 years and the outbreak of World War II before their anti-Semitism culminated in the destruction that Jews should be killed. In the Ottoman Empire and nascent Turkish nationalism, the idea of massive deportation and killing of the Armenians and other minorities had been brewing for at least 2 decades before World War I, during which it happened, under a radical Turkish nationalist regime. It is unrealistic to think that the legal concept of genocide can be severed completely from its sociological roots. And some contemporary arguments, for example, the New Lines report that we've referred to, which looks for an expansion of the present approach to genocide, is rather compatible with Dr. Svan's approach. As New Lines Professor Packer accepted in answer to the tribunal when giving evidence, legally defined genocides are a section of that much larger collection of activities sociologists identify of genocides. Sensing from what Dr. Svan said how what is happening to the Uyghurs may appear to a sociology genocide expert may not be unhelpful for those having to focus on what may be a legally defined one. On genocide, on intention itself, genocidal intention, the sociologist view, firmly expressed by Dr. Svan in a written note, about the difficulty of proving intent, is the lawyer's recurring problem in genocide's trial. And Dr. Svan's evidence doesn't loosen the tests that must be applied for any finding of genocide in law. It does help explain why such findings are very hard to reach. I turn to the law. 2 very distinguished legal experts, originally willing to help the tribunal, had to withdraw because of the sanctions that were imposed. It was decided not to try and involve other English legal experts into what was by now a sanctioned environment, and we turned instead to Andrew Crew from Malaysia, known to Mr. Vetch and myself, whose independence and legal skills were valued. And he worked with counsel who were already within the sanctioned environment to prepare legal advice. And as I've explained, that legal advice has been reduced into a series of directions to the tribunal as to how the law should be approached, just as a jury would be directed by a judge. And so for proof of torture, there's the Torture Convention definition, which is clearly met by the evidence that's been heard. It's important to know, looking at state responsibility for torture, that where pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person in acting in an official capacity, that has to be proved. As to crimes against humanity, proof is required of, first, the commission of certain prohibited acts when they are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against the civilian population. I'll come to the relevant prohibited acts a little later. An attack can be on a civilian population. Widespread means pretty much what it says. Systematic means pretty much what it says. What is important is that in a crime against humanity attack, the perpetrator, and here we are concerned with the person actually doing the thing complained of, the perpetrator must know that there is a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population and that his or her acts are part of that attack. He doesn't have to know the detail of the policy, but he has to know at least that. Finally, for genocide, certain prohibited acts, if committed with an intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected group as such, is required. And as such means that the intent is to destroy a collection of people who have a particular group identity. Taking it quickly, the protected groups are national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups and no other. The underlying prohibited acts, at least one of which has to be proved, is killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm, longer definitions, but you can read them, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring destruction. Number 4 is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And number 5 is enforcing transfer of children of one group to another. The intent to destroy is an intent to destroy the group, not the individuals. Destroy is limited to the physical or biological destruction of all or part of the group. When looking at genocide and what has to be proved and against whom or what, the perpetrator is now not the lower level perpetrator, the person actually doing it, it's the perpetrator at the top level, creating the policy that led to things or leads to things being done. As to inferences, where an inference is drawn as to specific intent, that inference must be the only reasonable inference from the totality of the evidence. There's quite a lot to be said about the responsibility of states, stranger states, or a state itself where genocide is alleged, emerging from the Genocide Convention, to which, as you will recall, 172 states, including the PRC and all other major states, are committed. The important one may be to have in mind, do you remember the requirement of states to act under the undertaking right at the beginning of the Genocide Convention? Later on, it's made plain that there has to be a determination, or has to be an intention of states to prevent genocide, to punish people who may be committing genocide, to investigate genocide. So, with the law more fully expanded in the document you can read, the tribunal noted in particular how the words destroy or destruction have no single and unique meaning. They are always context-specific. And that destruction has to be physical or biological destruction. Now, physical destruction is in part sufficiently contextual because killing members of a group would clearly be physical destruction of a kind, of a part of the group. But biological destruction has not, so far as the tribunal's lawyers have ascertained, ever been adequately defined by any court. And the tribunal found helpful the first, second, and last draft of the convention, because in the first draft, physical genocide was divided into 3 types: physical genocide with definitions, biological genocide with definitions, one of which was sterilization and/or compulsory abortions, and interestingly, cultural genocide, which then include forcible transfer of children. By the time of the second iteration of the draft, cultural genocide had been expanded, but transfer of children had been removed. The first 2 had been combined into a single physical and biological genocide, which included measures to prevent births. The final version, the Genocide Convention itself, has as the 5 acts: killing, causing serious bodily harm, inflicting conditions of life, imposing measures intended to prevent births, all originally covered in the first 2 forms of genocide, and suddenly reappearing is forcibly transferring children from one group to another. Something that had originally been in cultural genocide had been removed in the later iterations of genocide, and suddenly pops back up, unexplained, as one of the 5 acts. So the tribunal took the view that given that destroy in the convention, as finally formulated, is not defined, and that there's been limited consideration by courts of the prohibited acts set out in the convention, the tribunal considers it might be prudent to have in mind that how biological destruction was first narrowly defined and conceived. We look to that first iteration, even if the lawyers tell the tribunal that we shouldn't. Legal scholars and practitioners often argue that there's little need for genocide, when the formulation of crimes against humanity usually covers all acts that might constitute genocide, and crimes against humanity are equally as serious. The only difference is the particular intent, state of mind required of the potential offender or of the offending state. Without adopting this argument in any way, the tribunal can observe that it might be unwise to venture into territory where the law is not absolutely clear, if that lack of clarity might be used to attack the tribunal's judgment and deflect attention from matters of substance that can, as it happens, be dealt with, if at all, as crimes against humanity. So going through the process of reasoning, evidence, extra evidence, expert evidence, opinion we disregard but look at in case it's favorable to the PRC and the law, and so on. Further conclusions as to torture, and in summary, the tribunal is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that torture has been inflicted throughout the period leading up to 2021 by or at the instigation of or with the consent or the acquiescence of public officials or other persons acting in official capacities of the PRC or the CCP. Turning to crimes against humanity. Before we come to the list of acts that have to be shown, remember, there has to be an attack. It has to be widespread, and it has to be systematic. Was there an attack? Might it just have been that everyone in the PRC, or certainly in Xinjiang, was just suffering the same detention, surveillance, and so on and so forth? To which the answer is no. The number of Uyghurs detained, the number of mosques and graveyards destroyed or rendered unfit for purpose, sterilizations, abortions, repression of language, repression of religion, separation of Uyghurs wholly without justification, that shows there was an attack. Second, was the attack widespread and systematic? Well, as to widespread, the evidence shows it was happening across the region, particularly concentrated and impactful on the southern region, which is majority populated by Uyghurs. It's been organized, systematic, including the deployment of all-pervasive technology-based surveillance, including by something of which you can read called the Integrated Joint Operating Platform, which monitors by means of artificial intelligence as well as human intervention every facet of Uyghur life. It is hard to conceive of something more systematic. Which brings the tribunal to the 11 acts. The first is murder. For an act of killing to qualify as a crime against humanity act, there would have to be proof of the intent to kill or cause serious bodily harm by the perpetrator herself or himself. Insufficient evidence of that. That act is not proved. For extermination, there would have to be evidence of killings occurring on a mass scale. There is no evidence of mass-scale killings. For enslavement, there would have to be evidence of ownership over a person. Well, there's evidence of people being forced into labor in the region and elsewhere, but there's not actually evidence of ownership in the sense of buying or selling people, trading in them. The fourth act, deportation and forcible transfer, defined as coercive displacement of persons from area in which they are lawfully present without internationally or nationally, internationally permitted lawful grounds. The tribunals received evidence of large-scale forced coercive transfers of villages being knocked down without owners or occupiers' consent and occupants being relocated. The crime against humanity of deportation and forcible transfer of population is proved beyond reasonable doubt. Imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of the rules of international law. Number 5, the evidence of the imprisonment of over 1 million people is almost enough for me to mention without any reasonable cause, as the evidence shows, without any proper legal process. The tribunal is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the crime against humanity of imprisonment or severe deprivation of physical liberty is proved. Torture for crimes against humanity is much like torture under the Torture Convention. It's proved as a crime against humanity beyond reasonable doubt. Rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, and other forms of sexual violence, the next category of act. Well, rape being sexual penetration, however slight, of varying orifices by any object where such penetration occurs without the consent of the victim. The definition of rape may encompass invasion of any part of a victim's body. The perpetrator must intentionally commit the act, being aware that the victim doesn't consent to the act. The tribunal is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that this crime of rape and enforced sterilization and other elements of violent sexual abuse is proved. Persecution comes next, being acts that discriminate in fact and deny fundamental human rights laid down in international law and are carried out with the intention to discriminate on political grounds. And to discriminate on political, racial, ethnic, or religious grounds against an identifiable group, or that are collectively and universally recognized as impermissible. Evidence of economic deprivation, of discrimination of a personal nature, of plunder of property, of discriminatory judicial and legal practice, of restrictions placed on family life, of exclusion from certain professions, of restrictions placed on the rights of citizens coupled with attacks on the civilian population by seizure, collection, and forcing them to move to camps, all constitute acts of persecution. The tribunal is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that that crime against humanity is proved. Likewise, with enforced disappearance, of which we've heard a great deal, the tribunal is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that that is proved. Apartheid would have come next, but is an incompletely developed crime and is not considered incompletely developed by courts and law and so on. So we're not considering that. Inhumane acts is the infliction of great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health by means of an inhumane act. So residuary category, it encompasses acts not specifically enumerated. Evidence has been received which could be included within this category. Forcible imposition of hand people into Uyghur family homes, pervasive surveillance system throughout the region, destruction of mosques, repression of religious and cultural expression, forced coerced marriage. Satisfied beyond reasonable doubt is the tribunal that this crime against humanity is proved. Further, in light of the way in public and known to all, Uyghurs were discriminated against. For all of those facts found as proved, the tribunal is also satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that perpetrators of all those facts knew of the widespread or systematic attack against the Uyghur part of the population, so that their acts were part of the attack, even if they had no actual detailed knowledge of the attack overall. enough is proved against them to prove that the crime of crimes against humanity is proved against the PRC state. Turning to genocide, remembering a bit about the law, recalling a bit about the law, remembering that a plan is not essential but may help, and we've heard a bit about a plan, that motive is generally irrelevant because what's important is the intent at the moment some act is put into place. The policies may be achieved through genocide, but that's not a critical finding. That a perpetrator's specific intent has to be directed against destruction of a group in part, that's sufficient, as opposed to the whole. But that the part, if it is only going to be against part, must constitute a substantial part of the group, such that it is significant enough to have an impact on the group as a whole. Looking at those tests from the point of view of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, the intended measures themselves, together with an intent to biologically destroy, would meet the legal elements for genocide. The actual consequence on future birth rates may not be necessary, although if the consequences may be seen already to have happened, as indeed they have to some extent, then that may be instructive for identifying what was the perpetrators. And remember, perpetrator is the high level, people organizing things, running things, may be instructive for identifying any destructive intent. So running through the things that would have to be proved, were genocide to be proved, it's incontrovertible that the Uyghurs are a qualifying group. Of the 5 acts that would have to be proved, there have been killings, but the evidence doesn't show that the killings threatened the destruction of the group, so they aren't proved. Causing bodily or mental harm in order to destroy the group, not proved. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life likely to bring about its destruction. Again, much evidence showing such things happened, but insufficient to prove destruction. Turning to imposing conditions intended to prevent birth, the PRC has put in place a comprehensive system of measures to optimize the population, so-called the population in Xinjiang, with a particular focus on the southern region, which is majority Uyghur populated. It has sought to rebalance the respective Han and Uyghur populations, increasing the former and reducing the latter, by orchestrating in-migration of Han, out-migration of Uyghurs for labor purposes, but most effectively, as already explained, by reducing the birth rates and population growth of Uyghurs. This may even result in a reduction of the overall population over time. The tools of its policy include sterilization by removal of wounds, widespread forced insertion of effectively irremovable IUDs, equating to mandatory sterilization associated with forced abortions. These policies will result in significantly fewer births in years to come than might otherwise have occurred. The population of Uyghurs in future generations will be smaller than it would have been without these policies. This will result in a partial destruction of the Uyghurs. So in accordance with the Genocide Convention's use of the word destroy, this satisfies a prohibited act required for proof of genocide, but leaves unresolved whether the state intended this destruction, and if it did, whether the part to be destroyed was a sufficient part. We'll return to that. The 5th category of act that can lead to genocide is forcible transfer of children. Thousands of children, maybe hundreds, removed from the care of their families, sometimes with one or both their parents in prison, sometimes as young as a few months, placed in hand-run state institutions, including boarding schools and orphanages. Some parents have not known where their children are, or even whether they are alive or dead. These children not only removed from their homes and communities, but from their cultures. These acts are grave threats to the integrity of the Uyghur group and could be a means by which the state could effect its destruction of the group over the longer term. But so far as this tribunal is concerned, the law is insufficiently developed for the tribunal to conclude that these acts qualify as the act of transfer of children under the Genocide Convention. And indeed, the general caution exercised by the tribunal in making determinations about genocide referred to above is heightened. It's clear that destruction, even articulated as physical and biological, does not have a unique meaning. And it's easy to imagine circumstances where an intention to destroy by one means might be associated with an inconsistent destructive act, and that other destructive act might be consistent with some different but unproved intention. So the tribunal has taken into account all the policies and conduct concerning birth control measures exercised by the PRC, and in respect of that act is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that imposing measures to prevent Uyghur births matched the revealed intention of the PRC's leadership policies explained above, that have evolved into plans at every level of regional, local, and community government to reduce the Uyghur population and thereby to destroy, to an extent, by birth control and sterilization. Thus, and so far, in the judgment of the tribunal, torture is established beyond reasonable doubt. Crimes against humanity attributable to the PRC is established beyond reasonable doubt by acts of deportation, forcible transfer, imprisonment, severe deprivation of physical liberty, torture, rape, other sexual violence, enforced sterilization, persecution, enforced disappearance, and other inhuman acts. As to genocide, it will be clear from the above that all elements of an intended genocide to be accomplished by a convention-listed act imposing measures to prevent births within the group are established, subject only to whether the part that is subject of the intended destruction would qualify. If the part is sufficiently large, then genocide would be proved. The tribunal recognizes that this may be the first public evidence-based determination of genocide under Article 2D of the Convention, or of crimes under similar statute, crimes under statutes that are in similar terms. The tribunal would, as a whole, prefer not to make such a finding, and to allow findings of genocide to match more closely the likely general public understanding of the word. The tribunal recognizes that a finding of genocide based on control of genocide may even seem to some close to lawful management by governments of other societies elsewhere. In the back of some minds might be awkward and uncomfortable considerations about worldwide understandable population growth. Well, between 1945 and 1948, men and women who had had experience of one and usually two world wars and wanted to save us from the worst that we could do to ourselves, drafted, among other things, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention. In the drafting process of the Convention, other modes of genocide, for example, of political groups, were decidedly left out. But imposing measures intended to prevent births was decidedly left in. And it would be defiant of the wisdom of those men and women whose experience of the worst of humanity was personal, not to find a breach of the Convention if one is proved. The tribunal feels some unease about making findings of this crime on the basis of evidence that links the crime to the very highest political figure of a country. It would seem altogether more appropriate for such things to be dealt with by governments or international organizations. But governments have no courage to do such things. Neither does the United Nations, where a powerful state is involved. And so it falls to this tribunal to make clear, on the basis of findings set out, that the unborn part of the Uyghur ethnicity of Xinjiang, calculated by consideration of the likely numbers of Uyghurs in years to come, that there would have been measured against the likely number of Uyghurs that there would have been had the Uyghurs not been treated in the way that they were by measures to prevent births, constitutes a substantial part for the purposes of the Convention. And accordingly, on the basis of evidence heard in public, the tribunal is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the PRC, by the imposition of measures to prevent births intended to destroy a significant part of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, as such, has committed genocide. Several points follow. First, this judgment, with no evidence of any mass killing, may be thought to diminish the perceived status of genocide as a crime, and in one way, it may do that, and if so, in one way, not necessarily a bad thing. The use of superlatives, world's gravest crime, and hyperbole, crime of crimes, when attached to tragedy, brings public attention, but sometimes at a cost to other tragedies, less able to attract attention despite being as serious. The suffering of the Uyghurs has attracted public attention by superlative and hyperbolic expressions of concern, for reasons that may not be entirely clear. Other suffering that has included large-scale killings of those without religious affiliation in North Korea, for example, or the Christians killed in Nigeria, or the Yazidi men and women killed by Daesh, but with less or no ability to have the label genocide attached to their suffering, have found it harder to gather public sympathy and support. And let's remember, most of those affected in Xinjiang are still alive, and their lives may, at some stage, improve. Further, in truth, genocide is not necessarily the worst of all possible crimes. Activating a dirty bomb in a city might be no genocide, despite the death and devastation it would cause. The Twin Towers attack was terrorism, but not genocide. So why should what has been happening to the Uyghurs be taken so seriously? The Genocide Convention was concerned at its creation in 1948 with the survival not of individuals, but of groups, national, ethnic, racial, religious groups. It looked forward to how they might be saved from destruction. It looked to stimulating actions in other countries to support the existence of such groups, even before a first act of destruction may have occurred. That ambition, it might be thought, is as important today as then. Ours is a world of many nations, ethnicities, races, and religions, all of which are entitled to survive, all of which are supported by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, none of which is to be extinguished. But Some might say what happens in Xinjiang is merely the encouragement to assimilation of groups, assimilation being something that's happened naturally throughout recorded history, and that the PRC might simply be bringing greater security, borders, and a country of a single character by what it's doing. Such thinking might, of course, be misguided because the experience of many ethnicities is that they have a great power to survive despite attack. But assimilation by encouragement or force would set at naught the value of diversity experienced in everything humans do and how they live. And so even without Dr. Zwan's important observation about how long murderous genocides may take to develop, it can be said that the method of genocide involved in this judgment, a genocide the intention of which is evidenced by the other crimes of humanity and by the use of torture, is indeed grave. Some of the surrounding support for Uyghurs in governments and parliaments and the media may have been driven by envy of China's success, by fear of China, and so on. But their support can now be seen to have been justified. The tribunal makes no recommendations, but a second point is this. The tribunal has no power of any kind to sanction the PRC or individuals in the PRC. It assumes politicians, civil society, NGOs, powerful individuals who have powers of sanction and who can make their voices heard on issues to which this judgment may relate will do so. Much of the material before the tribunal has been for some time in the public domain from other sources, and it could reasonably have been expected that governments, organizations, and businesses interacting with the PRC will have already factored in what was revealed in that material and now in this judgment. And indeed, it's worth noting that the US government has, through its two secretaries of state, as it happens, asserted genocide's been occurring, and that some sanctions have been imposed by the USA, the European Union, and the United Kingdom in respect of human rights abuse, but without tying it to that undertaking, that critical undertaking referred to right at the beginning of the Genocide Convention. 3, staying with accusers. The accusers in those several parliaments that found genocide by the PRC reached accurate conclusions, even without the weight of evidence considered by the tribunal. Perhaps governments of their countries that have not acted under the convention and its undertakings should now be a little more respectful of their legislators' opinions. It is unfortunate that no efforts have been made by those or other countries to have the issue dealt with at the International Court of Justice, as might happen if a country had the courage to take the matter there, notwithstanding the PRC's reservation concerning that court's jurisdiction. Maybe the jurisdiction would now be found not to be of effect. Maybe the PRC, if confident of its opinion, would not want to hide, as if in shame, behind the reservation. A fourth point. From the PRC's and CCP's points of view, there is no appeal from the judgment of this People's Tribunal or from the opinions elsewhere about these matters adverse to the PRC. They all stand unless corrected. Now, China is one of the oldest civilizations existing today, and yet it faces determinations supported by evidence that would show it to be, in part, and the parties of the government, not the people, wholly wicked. These determinations cover a period when the PRC has been establishing itself as the most powerful nation on earth, or soon to be, the most populous, perhaps financially one of the or the most successful. Was conduct of which the tribunal has heard and read necessary for it to achieve what is clearly within its general, overall, ambitious grasp? Might China instead have achieved all it lawfully may seek, and to become a country to envy, emulate, and admire without being in its approach towards the Uyghurs, as the judgment reveals, as bad as it has been? May what the tribunal have been dealing with have been unavoidable, unnecessary human tragedy, sad in the extreme for all observers to behold, devastating and worse to have experienced as victim. Could the wonderful, diverse entity of China have expected better of itself? Could we have expected better of China? The PRC is said to want to expand its influence economically and by other means. It has within grasp an immense power to influence the world by submission of its actions to the world's highest courts, the ICJ, the ICC. That would be leadership by example, a willingness to expose conduct of state or of individuals to international public review, something the rest of the world's citizens might want, even if something that their governments, especially if large governments of large and powerful countries, might fear. And before the PRC should reject the idea, given the worldwide concerns about treatment of the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, and now this judgment, might it, on behalf of its 1.4 billion citizens, consider what those in other countries who buy T-shirts made of cotton coming from Xinjiang, computers, and other items from all over the PRC, what must they think of a country that fears its own people using their intellects freely, that applies barbaric methods of torture to people as if hoping to change their minds permanently, that squashes 1 million or more of its people together in cells so small they cannot even lie down to rest, that so coarsens its citizens working in detention centers as to allow women citizens to be raped or gang raped and men to be raped when in the custody of the state. Those not from China, understanding that preserving what in translation is called face is of critical importance to all in China, leaders and followers, does the PRC think that this conduct does anything to preserve face and dignity? Does it think that those from foreign lands will be unaffected by the truth that has emerged and emerges further in this judgment? Will its leaders and citizens really keep face as those facts are ever better known? Might its own citizens prefer to see this judgment and other opinions adverse to the PRC subject to international scrutiny? 5, and then I'm nearly done. The tribunal's work, lasting a little over a year and accomplished with pro bono or lightly paid researchers and otherwise wholly dependent on the unpaid contributions of very many people, has been comparatively straightforward. It's work that has been done in the shortest possible time because it is recognized that making public gross wrongs committed in other countries can have positive effect, even without actual government-to-government or United Nations-to-government confrontation. It is work the product of which may now limit the brutality of crimes against humanity and genocide demonstrated in various forms, that may save lives, may allow the unborn to be born, may save women from having their ability to give life brutally destroyed, once needing to be done. As the work done by this tribunal was, it had to be done urgently. 6th, a final reflection. If rights are truly universal, then they are matched by universal duties, and those duties are personal. Not only is your right as an immediate neighbor your neighbor's duty to uphold, but your neighbor's duty even on the other side, your neighbor's right, even on the other side of the planet, is similarly your duty to uphold if ever possible. International bodies, nation states, big NGOs deliver some part of the individual's duty. But that doesn't mean that that personal duty to be honored citizen to citizen wherever possible does not exist. The personal duty can be delivered in part through the ballot box that elects leaders who do, or often do not, respect and support the rights of citizens everywhere. The personal duty includes choices of how and where to deploy influence, of how to spend money and time, of where to study and with whom. So if the citizen is left by governments or other bodies that avoid finding and revealing certain truths, if the citizen is left uncertain about events near or far away, then the citizen's duty that might be activated is suppressed. That is why, when governments avoid that genocide convention undertaking, it is appropriate for citizens, as in this tribunal, to do what governments fear to do, no more than to fill a gap in knowledge that could and should have been filled by others. The tribunal has respected the PRC and its people, recognizing the significant differences of culture between them, differences in approach of PRC citizens to authoritarian regimes. The tribunal has considered only the clearest breaches of international standards of law to which the PRC is fully committed, acting with great care to reach its decisions. So much for the tribunal. Maybe the public, whom the tribunal serves, better informed of world affairs, if less experienced in the realities of war than the drafters of the 1948 documents, would have more concern for victims in far-off lands than their leaders might expect. Maybe they could see the sense in having a document easier to apply than the Genocide Convention, such as perhaps a convention to prevent crimes against humanity, to drive their own countries to act without delay, when 1 million and more are interned in order for their minds, born free, to be trained to follow a single line of thinking, their bodies to be at the disposal of those who would rape or torture, their rights to bring new life into the world curtailed, not just in the genocidal way identified, but by effective separation of sexes through forced labor, or by children created in human relationships lost not through death, but through non-human alienation, achieved by being entered into a state-run model-making machine. Maybe they, the public, we, the public, more than political leaders and international bodies, know that wherever and whenever gross human suffering occurs, action must follow from the needless suffering of fellow citizens anywhere in the world. It can never be right to look away. We'll adjourn for a period, and then there'll be a press conference, I think.
the Uyghur Tribunal has concluded that the government of the People's Republic of China is guilty of committing crimes against humanity and genocide against the Uyghur people. This is a rare moment of accountability for the families of victims and the survivors of the PRC's regime's cruelty. Over the past year, the Tribunal has amassed by far the most comprehensive body of evidence on the Uyghur crisis in existence. Following a rigorous and impartial process, this People's Tribunal of objective professionals, all instructed fully on applying law, have concluded that the PRC is perpetrating genocide. The Tribunal has worked to the highest criminal standards and has proof beyond reasonable doubt. And we want to put on record our thanks to all of those that came forward and provided testimonies. This emphatic decision must now compel the UK government to take action in accordance with its international legal obligations. Under Article 1 of the UN's Genocide Convention, which the UK and China are signatories to, states have a duty to prevent genocide by all means possible and punish the perpetrators. And this obligation is triggered the moment a state learns that there's a genocide, which the UK has heard today. Our government now has a duty to engage all statecraft, due diligence, risk assessment, all internal and international toolkits available to ensure we are not aiding or abetting the Uyghur genocide. It was noted by Sir Geoffrey that in April, Parliament made history by recognising unanimously that the treatment of Uyghurs in China is genocide. We were joined by parliaments in Canada, Netherlands and the United States. At that time, the government refused to act. Today, everything has changed. Today, the Uyghur Tribunal has declared that a genocide is taking place, and we are demanding that the UK government makes time for debate in both houses to discuss what urgent action they will take next. We urge our government to carry out the review of export controls they promised in January. They must put in place sanctions on the architects of this genocide, including Chen Quango. They must put import controls on the products of Uyghur slave labour, and they must acknowledge in public that the Chinese authorities are committing genocide against the Uyghurs and engage with their legal duties to protect the Uyghur people. 51 years ago, the United Kingdom signed up to the UN Genocide Convention, designed to ensure that atrocities like those that happened during the Second World War could never again take place. Yet, in the 75 years since the Nuremberg trials, the UK has never succeeded in recognising a genocide while it was ongoing. With today's verdict, we have a chance to put that right. Never again should mean just that, never again. And we implore the government to stand up for the Uyghur people and stand by its UN obligations to prohibit the acts of genocide and to hold those responsible to account, and to ensure that we are in no way complicit in this ongoing genocide. I now turn to Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
I am here also as a member of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which contains members here, many of whom myself, Nuz, Lord Alton, and others have all been sanctioned by the Chinese government. We're here as well, and I am also the co-chair of an all-party parliamentary group on Magnitsky sanctions. And yesterday, in anticipation of this result, we called on a list of Chinese officials and a business to be sanctioned under the Magnitsky proposals. And this will be another area that we will be wanting to look at following this report. I completely support what my colleague Nuzgani has said, which is we now need the British government, in the light of this report, to look carefully at this report and then come forward to both House of Commons and the House of Lords to have a full debate with the government at the dispatch box explaining what their position will be now with regards to genocide of the Uyghur people. They have failed so far to do that. We now need the government to step up and do that. And all the other issues around the products coming out of Xinjiang now also have to be dealt with in line with what the government previously said they would do but has yet to do. This cannot be trumped. This is the most serious issue that could ever happen in a country to its people. The idea that a country's government would so determine that a particular ethnic group of people were not worthy of living or even living in that country is absolutely clearly genocide when you see what's happened as a result. And so we call upon the British government now to step up, to make those changes, to have that debate, and finally to declare genocide.
I now turn to Lord Alton.
I endorse everything that's been said by Nusrat Ghani and by Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. My own interest in this issue goes back many, many years. I visited Western China, and I am Vice Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Uyghur Group. The evidence that we've heard this morning, as set out by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC and by the Uyghur Tribunal, is truly harrowing. It was shocking to hear about the systematic campaign to obliterate this population, to reduce this population, and to hear this finding of genocide. As Sir Geoffrey made clear, crimes against humanity are proven too in the most appalling cases of torture, rape, the mass movements of people, 1 million more who are in re-education camps. What are we going to do about this? The Foreign Secretary has herself, Liz Truss has said, this is a genocide. Well, when words like this are used, it shouldn't be for rhetorical effect or for hyperbole. This is in line, as Sir Geoffrey made clear, with the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide. Genocide has been found. What are we now going to do about that? One practical thing, of course, will be to make clear that there will be a total diplomatic and ministerial boycott of the genocide Olympic Games. A second thing will be to stop companies operating in this country who have direct links to genocide in Xinjiang. One example is Hikvision, banned in the United States, but not here, and many of us have been calling for it to be banned here. And there are many other practical actions which can be taken. It is for the government now to come forward with those, and I agree with Sir Ian that there should now be a full-scale debate in both houses following the finding today, so that parliamentarians are able to say to the government, we expect action now to be taken. I'd make one final point, which is that during the Trade Act, I moved an amendment in the House of Lords, which went to the House of Commons, and by a whisker failed to be incorporated in that Act. It would have empowered the High Court of England and Wales to do the job that has fallen on Sir Geoffrey Nice QC and this independent Uyghur Tribunal to do. It should not have been left to them. They have been extraordinary in their diligence. They've been magnificent in the way that they have courageously gone about this work. But it should not have been left to them. It is the duty of governments who say it is a matter for courts to determine whether a genocide has occurred or not, to make sure that such a route is opened. That route is not there at the present time, and that is still the major defect that this government and all governments have to address.
We have with us on the stage Rishan Abbas, Rahima Mahmoud, and Dulkan Issa from the World Uyghur Congress. I think Dulkan will say a few words, and then we'll field some questions from the floor. Dulkan?
Thank you. I, on behalf of also Uyghur community around the world, welcomes with great encouragement the final judgment of the Uyghur Tribunal, which announced today that Chinese Communist government atrocity crime against the Uyghurs and the other peoples of Turkestan amount to genocide and the crime against humanity. This is the historical day for the Uyghur people. We can only hope that the world takes meaningful steps to end the genocide, crime against humanity, and the torture, that the perpetrators, Chinese Communist Party, is held responsible for such atrocity.
If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and tell me which media organisation you're representing. Yes.
DGN. You mentioned the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympic Games. Will you now be seeking a full sporting boycott of the Games as well?
I will let Sir Duncan Smith lead on that. We have been talking about a full diplomatic boycott, but we want to make sure that the term diplomatic is fully understood, don't we, Sir Ian?
Yes, yesterday in answer to a question, Prime Minister's questions, the Prime Minister appeared to agree that there would be a full diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games. That means, by the way, so that we can define it, means no government minister, no government official, including Foreign Office officials such as ambassadors, etc. That means nobody in an official capacity relevant to government can or should attend. Anyway, interestingly, the Chinese then reacted by saying they never invited them in the first place. So it looks like they've also made us a diplomatic boycotting country. But the main point is, you're asking about sporting boycotts. Now, I take a very simple view with this. I leave it up to individuals. Each sportsman or woman that takes part in the Olympics will have to make that decision for themselves. I've already spoken to the British Olympic Committee, and I said, you should now take a position to condemn what's going on in China, but your individual athletes can make their decision alone. And I hope that they will look at what's going on in China and ask themselves a very simple question: is it worth it? Worth it to endorse, by giving them that publicity moment, to endorse the terrible abuse that's taking place by the Chinese government?
Next question. Yes, please. From which news? So the question, if no one else can hear it, was about Hikvision, about supply chain transparency in procurement. I assume that was the point of your question. Well, the Business Select Committee, which I wrote a paper for on supply chains, asked for a review of which services we were using and whether they were making our infrastructure vulnerable to the Chinese state. But I'll let Lord Alton respond to the Hikvision question.
And I support what Nusrat has just said about supply chain transparency, and indeed I have a private member's bill before the House of Lords at the present time, which seeks to amend the Modern Slavery Act in order to introduce much more coherence in the way that we deal with supply chains. I would like to see kite marks on products telling us, not made in the PRC or made in China, but I would like to see kite marks that can guarantee that nothing within the supply chain can be attributed back to slave labor in Xinjiang. So that's on the first point. The second point, specifically about Hikvision, is I moved an amendment to the Telecommunications Act so that where in another jurisdiction of a Five Eyes country, and I was thinking particularly here of the United States, had banned a company on the grounds of evidence that it had seen of its involvement in the surveillance state in Xinjiang, then we would be required to review their status in the United Kingdom as well. That was not passed, but I still believe it would be the right thing to do. Ministers said that they were with it in spirit, or they should now be with it in practice, and should be reviewing companies like Hikvision, who are directly linked to the surveillance state, the controls that we've heard about today that have been imposed there, and as you've said in your question, are to be found on every high street pretty well in this country as well. Data collection is something we should be very, very concerned about.
We've also been joined on the stage by Baroness Helena Kennedy, and she's also one of our parliamentary colleagues that was sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. So what is your question?
Judgment for Uyghur Tribunal is coming up. Now I see such high-profile figures here, which helps with raising awareness. My question is that, are you interested in Uyghur Tribunal? Do you know about it, and will you be there?
I'm sorry, sir. This morning we're fundamentally focused on the Uyghur Tribunal and the announcement made by Sir Geoffrey this morning. If you want to refocus your question, I can return to you.
Okay, my question is that now, I mentioned the Uyghur Tribunal, but the result of this tribunal, that the judgment says that beyond reasonable doubt, the Chinese government is condemned of torture, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Now, what's the process from here? How are you going to go forward? How is it going to turn into, for example, a government condemnation or even a law or sanctions against China?
So I mentioned a list of things that we've asked our government to do to respond to the UN obligations and to ensure that we're not complicit. Looking at our supply chains, looking at procurement, and calling out the evidence that was stated today by Sir Geoffrey, but I'll let Sir Ian add to that.
Well, actually, I was just looking. Sorry, yeah. I've just been looking at the list for the full sanctioning under Magnitsky, which we held in a debate yesterday. I'm going to just read it out. It's about 3 or 4 people. This is number one, what the British government could now do, which is to go forward with these individuals and sanction them. The first is Chen Guangguo, which you've already heard about, but he's known as the architect of the appalling genocide that's taking place now in Xinjiang. He was also, by the way, for those who may not know this, the architect of the suppression of the Tibetan peoples and the destruction of their culture and their nature, and the fact that they're going into what is known as labor camps. Can I make a simple point here? We no longer call these labor camps. We call them what they are, concentration camps. It's high time we got this term right, because labor camps gives people a sense that somehow there's something possibly okay about them. These are concentration camps that we learnt the hard lesson about during the course of the last war. So some other names that are on that list as well, and I'm just reading them out to you now. The Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. That has to now be on it. It is a paramilitary organization. Pang Jiaru and Sun Jinglong both worked in the Xinjiang area, and they held senior positions and were responsible. And the final name is For Li Yu, as the former party secretary of the Xinjiang Public Security. The British government should now put Magnitsky sanctions on these immediately. It should hold that immediate debate about what to do with regards to declaring a genocide, and the British government should step up and give its opinion clearly, honestly, and openly now.
I know that Dulcan and Rahima have to do another interview. I'm just going to quickly come to Baroness Helena Kennedy to wrap this up for us. Thank you.
Let me start by saying that this was a very distinguished panel led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, who is one of the world's really most esteemed lawyers, really experienced in the field that we're talking about here today, and assessing evidence, looking at the standard as to which it must reach in order to be convinced of the seriousness and the gravity of the allegations that he was dealing with his panel. I really want the nation to listen to this. We have a duty under the convention to prevent genocide, not to wait until it's over. And that's why our government has to act. And I want to echo what Ian Duncan Smith has just said as my co-chair of IPAC. We really have to have our government take a stand on this. The evidence is clear. The evidence is absolutely there for anyone to see the gravity of what is being alleged here. And I really urge everybody who is concerned with justice in the world, concerned about the ways in which we do our business with the world, it's really imperative that we call upon our government to act now.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize, I can't take any more questions. Thank you so much.
I think we're all assembled. I'm afraid Ms. Rose had to leave because of other commitments. Otherwise, I think we're all here. Anybody has any questions, please let me know, and I'll see who's able to answer them. Yes?
From France. Did any of you receive any threats or intimidation before this verdict?
No.
Nothing at all? No pressure?
No, I mean, we were sanctioned, but that was all. And I explained only in short form how the sanctions actually had very limited effect. There was one way it had an effect, which was slightly unfortunate, and that is that Council's team was to have had a woman lawyer, a member of it, and unfortunately the sanctions, not on her, but for associated reasons, made that impossible, so that was unfortunate. We lost our two first choice, very senior lawyers who would have done things, no doubt, in their own way. We lost them. That was all. Of course, there have been plenty of ad hominem attacks on us, but we don't even bother to read them. Why should you?
Can I just go over one point that you made during your reading earlier, was that it's the tribunal's conclusion that everyone in the top levels of the Chinese government, including the president, was fully knowledgeable of what was going on and thereby fully sanctioned what was going on.
Why doesn't Mr. Vetch answer that? Because he's as familiar with the material as I am.
Yes, as Sir Geoffrey said in his statement, we had a significant amount of evidence linking by means of policy, speeches, visits to the area by President Xi and other senior officials in both the party and the government. And that was then underwritten and reinforced, if you like, by the leaked papers, commonly known as the Xinjiang papers, where we could make a direct link to policies, strategies, and the implementation of those to the most senior people in the government, including President Xi.
Sir Geoffrey, you mentioned the failings of governments and bodies such as the UN to make such a determination, and thus it's fallen to the tribunal to do so. Why do you think it is that such bodies have neglected in that responsibility?
It may be my colleagues will have other observations to make, because I get a bit close to this, and you've now heard from the politicians, Ian Duncan Smith in particular. So my perception is that countries don't like governments of countries don't like to be compelled to do things, even by the highest moral or ethical imperative. And it's worth noting that the Genocide Convention was not something that the United Kingdom wanted in 1948. It reluctantly signed up. It didn't ratify it until 1970. Likewise, America didn't sign up until later on in 1970s, and China. And they don't like being told to do, even when there's an absolutely irresistible imperative. And I don't know whether, as I wasn't in for all of the time that Mr. Ian was speaking, but last year and this year, there was an effort by Lord Alton to introduce an amendment to the trade bill that was going through Parliament, which would have said it was improper or wrong. You couldn't make a trade deal with a genocidal country. And the government put an enormous amount of effort and resources into stopping that amendment. And it's distressing to read. And from the point of view of the Uyghurs, for example, not wishing to diminish our abilities, but if that amount of effort by a government department had been put into the work we've done, this result could have been achieved more swiftly. But my friends who come, one of the great advantages of this tribunal is that I have colleagues from all different parts of English society in a way, because they're different disciplines, and maybe some of them would like to answer that. Let's see.
Thank you. I wouldn't claim great expertise in the area of why governments do or don't do things, but there is, obviously, one can look at the record over many years, and actually the record of countries avoiding findings and descriptions of other countries as committers of genocide, precisely because of what Jeffrey was talking about, the obligations under the convention to do something about it. I think that when one is addressing powerful countries in the world, then smaller countries feel reluctant to address it, I suppose, partly because fear of what the consequences will be, and partly because unless it can be coordinated with more powerful nations or through the UN, which at the moment is obviously blocked by the fact that the Security Council has people on it who are not interested in pursuing, oh, it's not even me, that's not interested in pursuing it, means that the UN is actually unable to do anything about it. And so the tribunal became necessary to fill that void and to fulfill a mission of informing people what was going on, what is going on, the broad parameters of which have been well known for some time, at least from going back 5 to 10 years when these policies in Xinjiang were intensified.
Can I go? So Jeffrey, hi, Sylvia from the Associated Press. Several legislatures around the world have declared genocide, and so has the US government. And your ruling is not the first and will add to that body. How confident are you, though, that it will make a difference to Chinese policy and how the British government handles this very thorny question? And I mean, does it? I mean, as an independent body, would the Chinese government take this seriously at all, or brush it aside?
It's a very interesting question. As a matter of detail, it's what, 6 parliaments, but it was actually the United States government itself, because it was the Secretary of State. So there's quite a difference, and the point that was made in the judgment at one stage is it's quite interesting that all these parliaments, 6 of them, have said it, the English parliament said it without opposition. It was a unanimous vote, and the government still do nothing. And the United States is a government that has said it and has still done nothing. So that's a bit of a problem. It seems to me that, well, first of all, we as a tribunal have no idea what effect there will be. We limit ourselves to providing an answer and hoping that use will be made of it. Perhaps I'll come back to that. But experience shows that this sort of process can have effect, so that you can have reports that don't get anywhere technically or formally. The best known one of which is reported at a higher level than ours. That's Justice Kirby's report for the UNH Human Rights Commission on North Korea, which has been stalled in the United Nations. So it's got nowhere, it's done nothing, and you could say nothing's happened. But if you talk to people on the ground, the fact of his statements, which are very powerful in that report, may well have affected the government of North Korea. But North Korea is never going to say as much. So sometimes you'll have effect, or such things will have effect, and you'll simply never know. Then the second way that I suppose these things may have effect is that, yes, they may drive governments to act because they just feel they can no longer live without the answer to the question. And I think there's a third way, but I've forgotten what it is. But it looks as though one of my friends wants to give an observation.
I think it's really important to understand.
And Ruminda does as well.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So Ruminda first, and then Mr. Bech.
Yeah, thank you. Where our decision, our judgment, our conclusion differs from others is that we've come to this through the evidence. And that evidence is freely available for all the public to see for themselves and gauge for themselves. So it's a kind of sharing event in a way. It's taken ages, 1.5 years, and we needed time and energy to do that. There's a lot of time and energy invested in this. Not everyone has that. So in that sense, this is a unique phenomena, if you can call it that. The second thing is that as Sir Geoffrey said, governments didn't rise up to the task, and therefore it was left to people like us to do it. So it's generated by people and is adding to the people's momentum, which is already out there.
I would like to add to that this body of evidence is there, and in a democracy like ours, I would throw it back to you, the press, and say that you can actually help to disseminate this and really make this evidence base very much available to the public to share it, because not everybody will go to the website and read it, but they will follow your news items, and an evidence-based argument that you can put forward, I think, as journalists, may have a bigger impact than we could possibly imagine. Thank you.
Well, Cockerell Coda story. Have you seen evidence that the witnesses who have come forward have been subjected to any kind of transnational repression from the Chinese state? And in light of the judgment today, will the tribunal be supporting the witnesses in any way in the coming months?
Well, that's another interesting question. And really, Mr. Hamid Sabi, who's sitting here, who was counsel to the tribunal, he might like to come and sit at the bench if he's got anything to say, because we operated a system of some separation of functions in order to ensure that there was independence of the evidence gathering or collection process in the tribunal. Mr. Vetch and I tended to walk across from one to the other, but now the position, so far as we know, because we were sometimes shielded from problems, is that there was definitely some intervention with witnesses, and perhaps Mr. Sabi will be able to tell us a bit more about that. That is direct interference. There's also another feature which I don't want to highlight, but I think is worth mentioning. When you find yourself involved with, as we were, of course, an activist group, the World Uyghur Congress, you've obviously got to be cautious about whether they're going to be acting independently and they're not going to be interfering with the witnesses or anything like that. And they were absolutely impeccable. From start to finish, they and all the people working with them were just like an independent process getting evidence for us. But sometimes you find yourself getting, or Mr. Sabi found himself getting closer to other organizations. And one of the sadnesses of the civil society world is that organizations that should be aligned sometimes become competitive amongst themselves, and that can sometimes operate as an impediment to getting at the best evidence. What we had to ensure was that the witnesses coming to us, were as free and as willing to give evidence as possible, and we did so. But that other little problem's a recurring one, and if only all organizations pursuing particular interest groups, let's not focus on the Uyghurs, there are many others, the more they can cooperate and not feel possessive about their evidence, the better. But see what Mr. Sabi's got to say. Where is he? Oh, there you are.
Thank you. The witnesses, of course, were attacked and harassed by the Chinese government in press conferences that the Chinese government organized. They brought, we think by force, their relatives to give evidence against them, to denounce them, to call them liars. And they have continued to harass them even when they are outside China. as near as 2 weeks ago, I was speaking to one of the witnesses who refused to testify because of the pressure that the Chinese government had put on her parents. She was so fearful that she didn't come to give evidence, and very important evidence, I must say, against the Chinese government. And they have continued to harass her with different means and putting a lot of pressure. The witnesses who are outside China are always fearful because if they are in a country that is close to China, there is always a threat, as you heard from the judgment today, that they may be abducted and returned to China. So that remains to be a problem. I hope Chinese government would now have the courage to stand up and say they will not continue with this practice, and the witnesses are protected from further harassment.
We've had a virtual question in from the South China Morning Post. Given that the Chinese authorities refuse to participate in the tribunal, they could attack the finding as one-sided. How does the tribunal account for this?
Was the last part that who can counteract the suggestion that it's one-sided?
Yeah, how do you account for this?
Well, I'm still not sure. Account for the fact they wouldn't take part, or account for the fact that our judgment is not one-sided?
Do you think the tribunal is one-sided because
no. And this is a very interesting and common, and understandably an interesting question. First of all, obviously we had to do everything we could to get China to participate. So we wrote to them at every, or to be precise, Mr. Sabi wrote to them on every opportunity, inviting them to take part, and notified them of all hearings and so on. You have to send it by letter because they have no other way of communicating. They won't let you get in by email or phone. Interesting. So you do that. When they decline to take part, you mustn't hold it against them, as you'll have heard me say twice in the judgment. Then what do? Well, you do what anybody does when a preferred piece of evidence isn't available. You make sure you find the best other evidence to reach whatever conclusion you can. You don't cut corners, and you try and raise issues that might have been raised by the PRC. Now, if you were here during the evidence hearings, there were a number of witnesses for whom the PRC had made public complaints, sometimes just general, and sometimes in detail. We always got them to deal with them. And you heard me say of 2 witnesses, but one fact witness, a really potentially very important fact witness, who we had no reason to disbelieve, but simply because it hadn't been possible for the PRC hadn't chosen to investigate or consider his evidence when they might have done, we decided we shouldn't act on it. So there are many ways in which you can be fair. And you know, if you think about domestic criminal trials, for example, it's often the case that there's no participation or involvement by an involved or concerned party. In murder trials, the victim is very rarely participating, for example, but you nevertheless manage to find out what happened. And often, for other reasons, parties don't take part. So it's an interesting question. You have to be alive to the problem, and you then do everything you can to counteract. It's not a difficulty to deal with the reality. Let's see if anybody else wants to say that. Yes, Dame Parveen.
Thank you very much. No, I entirely agree with you. It's always very difficult if we haven't got a balanced argument from both sides. But I think we did our utmost to make sure that all the evidence we did get was triangulated from several sides in several ways. So I hope we got to the right conclusion. And as Jeffrey said, we also tried to think what PRC might have asked from their side and tried to sort of answer that as well within. And I think you would have heard the Sir Jeffrey earlier on when he said that. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I'm Jane Warren from NTD News. So Jeffrey, I noticed that you mentioned about governments avoiding doing things out of fear. So I wondered if you had any examples of evidence that showed what was causing this fear mainly. Was it some external factors maybe from the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, obviously fear comes in many forms, and I'm not suggesting that the governments weren't doing it because they feared physical fear for themselves. But the most likely fear that governments experience when confronted with difficult decisions of this kind is what might happen to trade. Sometimes what might happen to important international relationships. What might happen to their voters' support. You can imagine a government, let's not say the United Kingdom government, we don't want to personalize it, but if you can conceive of a government confronted with a genocide convention duty, knowing that there was fairly fierce measures that it could and morally, ethically, legally should take to stop the alleged genocide happening, continuing to happen, to prevent it. Say really serious trade consequences which would be felt by its people, then the government would start fearing loss of its voters' base. Now, that's exactly the sort of thing that can operate on governments, and that raises really big questions. Are we humans, a single family? Do we actually owe a duty to look after ourselves? As by my observations about citizen-to-citizen duty, I suggested maybe we do. Governments don't like that because they are, especially in democracies, determined to be re-elected and to keep their voter base cheerful. So those are among the sorts of fears that I think governments have. And what was particularly striking for Mr. Sabi, Mr. Vetch, and me, because we were all associated with the China tribunal, the previous tribunal, that looked at forced organ harvesting. Now, at that stage, China was still everybody's best friend. And so there was absolutely nothing that the government would say explicitly favorable to what we were doing. And you could say there must have been a reason for that because the evidence was overwhelming and that they were fearful of something. What's been rather interesting is that through no desire of ours, we suddenly found ourselves at the beginning of this year, after all, the end of last year, when we'd already started work, there was suddenly a big following wind of support for anti-PRC, pro-Uyghur activity. It didn't affect us. What is it reflecting government? That something that had been stopping them doing something before had changed. A fear, whatever it was, had disappeared. Anybody else? Yep. Yes.
So one aspect of this question, too, goes back to what Geoffrey was saying about the support which the tribunal didn't get from governments despite requests. And the similar question, I think, applies to those governments, including the UK government. Why did it not provide evidence which it had, despite the many requests which we made? Why did the US government not provide evidence to us, despite that express finding of genocide, as Geoffrey said, unexplained, unsupported by any evidence, but just simply a statement that China was committing genocide in Xinjiang? And I think that is just as difficult a question to answer as the reason why people take no action under the Genocide Convention or more general rules on international cooperation for genocide and other crimes, international crimes.
Are we done? Ah, there's somebody in the hall. If that's allowed, I don't see why not. We can't hardly be a democracy without allowing someone in the hall to speak.
This is what, yeah. Rabia Khan, member of the public. Thank you for today. and for all of your work. I have seen the report has been published online, and I will be reading it after this session, and looking forward to spending a bit more time pondering the findings. My question to the panel is about Chinese investment into UK universities, and particularly educational institutes. So there's a lot of Chinese investment coming into UK universities for various reasons. In light of today's judgment, what would you say to those universities? Do you think today's judgment should have a bearing on the decisions to accept investment, to accept projects, ties? What influence should it have on relationships?
Thank you. I've got 3 professorial colleagues. One other has not been able to attend today, so they're going to have a view, which I will, of course, let them explain. And if any of them is not able to explain, they may, of course, have their own internal concerns about not answering the question. But the question, and I'm not going to answer the question specifically, although I can see that Professor Kaur is dying to, so I'll let her get in a second. But it is clearly the case that amongst the people who have to make decisions when this kind of information comes up are universities, both because of campuses they set up in other countries and because of the dependence there is in this country on the funding. And they're amongst many institutions that have to consider that. It was lightly touched on in the judgment, but in the previous judgment, you'll see that it was spelled out a little more specifically when it said that all those bodies, including academic institutions, had to decide, to the extent revealed in that judgment, how they should react with a criminal state, to the extent that criminality was shown. Before Professor Kaur speaks, I would simply say that there no doubt can be balanced decisions. It's all very well for us to be completely moral and want everything to be completely easy. You just do this and you never do that. Somebody was asking me about this earlier. You know, maybe governments haven't any choice but to do nothing when a genocide occurs. Maybe, but they should always say to their voters and public, genocide is happening, for example, and the reason we're not doing this is this. It should be completely open. And it may be that universities tussling with these very serious problems should think that whatever their resolution, they must be clear about what they accept has happened. I don't think I can keep Professor Kaur waiting longer.
Yeah, I'll be brief. And I speak from a personal capacity. So there's 2 problems. One is that universities are seriously struggling and underfunded. So that's a national issue. That's due to the national government. And as a result, they are open to other kinds of investments. Many of them are coming from China. And so often they're in this tricky position where they have to think of their livelihood or their sustenance, and at the same time they're aware of various issues around taking on such contracts. And there are a fair number of universities in UK and worldwide who are in these kinds of relationships. Plus there's the Confucius Institute, which one needs to also consider. And I think on this matter, one has to, especially the executives, along with the governments in those countries, have to look very seriously at what they're doing and the consequences, especially when it comes to areas like AI and other areas which might be linked to these chain supplies that we and others have identified. So I think there's a serious issue here of a rigorous self-examination and re-evaluation of what universities are doing and need to do.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just say that some of the students we've had from China have been absolutely superb, and I wouldn't wish to stop that interchange of both research and education across countries. I think in view of what Professor Kaur just also said, universities are very underfunded and dependent on a lot of money. But I think, from outside the country, but I think each institution ought to look at this themselves. It is not for us to say where they should go, and also really analyze what is it that they're doing. Do they believe in maybe research and exchange of ideas above humanity? Well, that's up to them. But the important thing, I think, is that we as a world, as a planet, need to go forward. We need to talk to each other. Obviously, in this sort of situation, it's difficult. But I also think that the sins of the government, sorry, this is a personal view, should not be put down to the sins of the people. The people may not actually agree with what the government's doing. Thank you.
Finally, for the triumvirate of professors, Professor Osler.
Thank you. I think I would reiterate the problem of our universities as being severely underfunded. I would also acknowledge how much I've learnt from students and colleagues from around the world. But I think in the end, decisions will be made in universities in one by one, but also according to the pressures that university staff through their unions and students feel about these issues. And I'm pretty convinced that the decisions that university executives will make will not just be influenced by funding streams, but by the concerns of their own staff and the concerns of their students. I think a lot hangs on those bodies through trade unions and student organizations and unions. Thank you.
Right, I suspect that's about it. Is that about it? One more? Sorry?
We probably have time for one more.
Maybe nobody else wants to ask anything. Ah, there's one at the front there. Frankie, down there.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the judgment. My name is Moazem Beg. I'm a former Guantanamo prisoner of the United States of America and the outreach director of CAGE. The reason I got involved in getting concerned with the case of the Uyghurs is because 22 of them were held without charge or trial with us in Guantanamo, and one of the things they told me was that they were thankful that they were sent to Guantanamo and not to China. But because of the language of the war on terrorism, and something that you alluded to in your judgment, has given China some cover, to what extent do you think it has exploited that language and has been able to get away with the targeting of Muslims in East Turkestan as extremists and terrorists, if that didn't exist? Thank you.
Thank you. The full answer to that is probably best from not us, but from an academic with a larger view of recent history, because although we've done work on evidence presented to us, we don't pretend to academic expertise. We can deal with the question, but I'm going to ask, first of all, Mr. Vetch, if he'd like. No? Anybody else? Mr. Clark? Yes, and then I'll come back to it.
Yeah. No, I think that the point you make is a very good one. I think that particularly if you go back to the immediate period after 9/11, 20 years or so ago, in that period, I think that China had an ability to sweep its approach to the Uyghur problem under the global war on terrorism, and it did do that. And in fact, it persuaded the US to join in the categorization of a Uyghur group outside Xinjiang as a terrorist group. And that application of that name lasted, I think, until about 2018 or so. I think, as this is, again, just a view, is that I think that reduced that ability to persuade people that their treatment of the Uyghurs was justified as a part of the global war on terrorism has declined, particularly as the treatment of the Uyghurs became more extreme from sort of 2014 onwards. I think people were less willing to accept, and particularly since the evidence of terrorism in a way which perhaps the wider world would understand it was extraordinarily limited, with every element of violence in Xinjiang and and outside being categorized as terrorism. And I think that had an effect over time. But that's just a view. As you say, Geoffrey, I have no academic research to back it up.
Thank you for that. Anybody else on this? And the history is particularly well covered in two of the reports I spoke of. The Aspie report, the Australian report, deals with it quite well, and also, to some extent, the Holocaust Museum report. Yes, nothing else I can say in particular, but thank you for your contribution. And I think that's probably, thank you. Oh, one more.
Sorry for keeping you. I'm Jennifer Venice from the International Bar Association's Global Insight magazine. And I wondered why you expressed that you'd felt apprehension or concern about delivering a judgment of genocide on the basis of this prohibited act alone, given that it is part of the convention. As you mentioned, it was written in.
Well, it wasn't possible to be satisfied that the law allowed a disconnect between a precise intention and the acts concerned. On the other hand, it was quite clear that if there was, as we found, a precise match between the intention and one of the defined acts, there could be no challenge to that. So as I made clear, without being express, there might have been an inclination on the tribunal or desire to say perhaps one of the others might have qualified. But in the absence of certainty that a mismatch of intention and act, it was probably in every way appropriate to find as we did. To spell that out in just a tiny bit more detail, because these are difficult areas for people who haven't spent a quantity of time thinking about these things. If you consider the determination made about measures to prevent births, the intention is to prevent births, to stop children being born. It's very simple. If you look at the next possible category of act, which is transfer of children, transfer of children, what's the expectation? Well, it's not that they're not going to have children. It may be the hope that they will have children with Han and dilute the ethnicity. It's a totally different specific intention. If you go back to the first iteration of the convention, you'll see that the various categories then proposed had subcategory definitions. That would have made life much easier. We've been left without that. And it is very important that our findings should be completely secure if it is to be of value. I hope that will do as an answer. And on that note, thank you and farewell.